Picture this. It's a sunny Sunday afternoon in 1870s London. The birds are chirping, the bees are buzzing, the kids are laughing, and the family's all gathered together for a lovely meal under a large oak tree, directly beside a freshly inscribed headstone. Welcome to the weirdly wholesome world of Victorian cemetery picnics, where the grass was green, the ham was carved, and the neighbours were definitely gone. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic why Victorians hosted picnics in graveyards and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. To our modern sensibilities, this sounds like the premise of a very polite horror film. We picture cemeteries as places of quiet mourning, not checkered blankets and lemonade. But in the 19th century, Victorians cheerfully mixed mourning with mustard sandwiches and made the graveyard the place to spend a weekend afternoon. And the wild part, they didn't think it was weird at all. Let's get one thing straight from the start. Victorians were obsessed with the unalive, not in a goth teenager listening to sad violin music kind of way, but in a deeply institutionalized, culturally sanctioned and aggressively accessorized kind of way. Unaliving wasn't something that happened in a sterile hospital room. It happened in the parlor. It happened often. It happened loudly. And when it did, people brought out the mourning clothes, the funeral biscuits, and eventually the picnic baskets. But before we break out the chicken drumsticks, let's back up and set the scene. By the mid-1800s, cities like London were bursting at the seams. The population exploded faster than a teapot on too much coal, and open green spaces were hard to come by. If you weren't wealthy enough to have a private garden, and let's face it, most weren't, your options for fresh air and a decent view were painfully limited. Enter the cemetery. These weren't the creepy, overgrown graveyards of modern horror movies. The Victorians had started building what they called garden cemeteries, beautifully landscaped spaces on the outskirts of cities. These cemeteries had winding paths, manicured lawns, ponds with ducks, and angel statues that looked like they cried poetry. In short, they were some of the only intentionally green, peaceful, and semi-public areas available to everyday city dwellers. So what did people do when they wanted to enjoy the outdoors with their family on a Sunday afternoon? They packed a picnic and visited the local cemetery. It was free, it was clean, and as long as you were respectful, nobody raised an eyebrow if you unwrapped a meat pie next to Aunt Mildred's eternal resting place. In fact, you might even get a nod from the family on the next grave over. It was like tailgating for the afterlife. Modern audiences recoil at the idea of eating in a graveyard because we see passing away as something sterile and remote, something hidden behind hospital doors and euphemisms. The Victorians didn't. They lived with it, sometimes quite literally in the house, and they didn't sanitize it out of existence. Cemeteries weren't off limits to the living, they were a part of life. People visited them often not just to grieve but to maintain relationships with the deceased. Yes, maintain relationships with the deceased. Some families brought food not just for themselves but for their dearly departed, laying out a small symbolic plate for Grandpa next to the wine and custard tarts. It was less morbid than it sounds. For them it was comforting, a gesture of continuity, like saying you're still part of us, here's a sausage roll. Now let's be honest, part of the appeal was practical. Cemeteries were some of the cleanest, safest public places around, with city parks still rare and sanitation levels in urban neighborhoods dipping somewhere between questionable and plague adjacent. A well-kept cemetery looked like paradise. It had shade, benches, fountains, flowers, and best of all, space. Nobody was trying to sell you eels or pick your pocket. The only thing quietly judging you was a statue of a cherub. And the practice wasn't limited to London. Across Europe and in the United States, families treated cemeteries like public parks. Places like Mount Auburn Cemetery in Boston and Père Lachaise in Paris drew regular visitors, not just mourners but strollers, readers, couples, and yes, picnickers. Newspapers from the time occasionally reminded people to be mindful of rowdy children near the graves, which really tells you everything you need to know about how normalized this all was. So, were the Victorians morbid? Yes. Were they also incredibly practical about their morbidity? Absolutely. Eating by a gravestone wasn't seen as disrespectful. It was seen as familiar, comforting, and deeply human. Passing away was part of life, and life, as far as they were concerned, should still include lunch. So the next time you're looking for the perfect picnic spot, and every park is crowded, consider this. The Victorians would have picked the cemetery, and they'd have brought a pot of tea, a lace cloth, and an extra fork, just in case Cousin Harold wanted to drop in from the afterlife. Victorians didn't just grieve the pass away. They practically rolled out the black carpet and made it a lifestyle brand. Today, mourning means maybe a funeral, a tearful post on social media, and awkward silences at brunch. But in the 19th century, mourning wasn't a moment. It was a multi-stage performance with rules stricter than a Victorian corset. At the center of this cultural phenomenon, Queen Victoria herself, the original goth icon of the British Empire. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria went full mourning mode, and then just never stopped. For the next 40 years, she wore black, had his rooms maintained like he was just out running errands, and refused to entertain the idea of moving on. Basically, she invented the emotional equivalent of ghosting, only the ghost was her husband, and the vibe was national grief, and the nation followed suit. Victorian society, already enthusiastic about ritual and restraint, seized on mourning like it was a new sport. There were rule books, actual printed guides for how long you should mourn depending on your relationship to the deceased. Lost a spouse, that's at least 2 years of full mourning. Black crepe, black veils, black gloves and black parasols. You couldn't even wear shiny buttons. It was like fashion was personally offended that you still had a pulse. Lost a cousin you kind of liked? Congratulations, you're now in half mourning, where grey and lavender were the edgy choices, but don't even think about wearing anything cheerful like pink. That was social heresy. The mourning period was a timeline you didn't mess with unless you wanted to be judged harder than a 3-legged race at a funeral. These weren't just fashion choices. They were deeply coded emotional signals. Mourning clothes communicated everything from the depth of your sorrow to your social status. It was like Instagram, if Instagram were made of wool and sorrow and dictated how long you could avoid parties. Women especially bore the brunt of this emotional choreography. Society expected them to embody grief literally, to wrap it around themselves, wear it in layers, and accessorize it with jet jewelry and melancholic facial expressions. Even mourning jewelry was an entire genre unto itself. Think lockets with hair from the deceased woven inside, or rings made from black enamel with the person's initials delicately engraved. That's right, Victorians were wearing passing people's hair as accessories. Your engagement ring might be a symbol of love, but theirs was a portable shrine to Aunt Mildred's scalp. And let's talk about etiquette. If you were in mourning, you didn't go to the theatre. You didn't attend balls. You didn't even make social calls unless they were strictly necessary. And when you did, your conversation better be as muted as your wardrobe. Laughter was out, flirting was treason. Even smiling too much could earn you side-eye from the more devout mourners who had perfected the art of looking nobly devastated. All of this elaborate grieving had a curious side effect. Passing away wasn't taboo. Unlike today, where we try to keep it out of sight and out of mind, Victorians invited it into their living rooms, sometimes literally. Photographs of the pass-away, we'll save that cheery bit for a later chapter, were common, and household decor often included mementos of lost loved ones. Mourning wasn't a private pain, it was a social institution, a way to show respect and maintain appearances in a world where reputation mattered more than emotional health. Of course, this wasn't all just about personal grief. It also reinforced a very Victorian obsession: control. Victorians believed in order, routine, and keeping emotions on a tight leash, preferably with silver embroidery. Mourning gave them a way to feel like they were in charge of the most chaotic event of all, passing away. If you could schedule sorrow, ritualize it, and put it in a dress code, maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't hurt as much. But as much as mourning was about order, it was also deeply performative. Wearing the right black, shedding the right number of tears but not too many, and isolating yourself just enough to show you cared. It was a high-stakes balancing act. Mourn too little, and you were heartless. Mourn too long, and people started wondering if you were just using it as an excuse to cancel dinner plans forever. And while men were technically expected to mourn too, let's be honest, they got the easier end of the casket. A dark suit and a sad hat could cover their emotional obligations. Meanwhile, women were layering crepe over corsets and trying not to pass out at funerals because fashion said breathability was a luxury, not a right. By the time we circle back to those picnics in graveyards, it'll make a little more sense. Victorians didn't hide from death. They dined next to it, wrote poetry about it, wore it around their necks, and organized their calendars around its etiquette. So the next time someone mourns a breakup with ice cream and sweatpants, just remember, you could have been wearing a black veil for 2 years while clutching a hair brooch and whispering elegies over your toast. Victorian mourning wasn't just sad, it was a whole lifestyle brand with seasonal collections and emotional bankruptcy built right in. If you had the misfortune of being born in Victorian London, congratulations, you're now wedged into a city that smells like a burning sock and sounds like a coughing contest. Between industrialization, a booming population, and some truly regrettable urban planning decisions, open space was not just rare, it was practically mythical. So when it came time for a Sunday outing, you either huddled in a smoky alley, sat in traffic behind a horse's behind, or, well, you took your lunch to the nearest graveyard. Odd? Maybe. But let's be honest, in a city with more people than plumbing, the cemetery was the closest thing to a luxury resort. By the mid-1800s, London was a pulsating, soot-coated machine of human chaos. In just the first half of the 19th century, the population had doubled, and no one had told the streets to expand accordingly. Picture tiny, crooked alleyways bursting with carriages, vendors, street urchins, and occasionally a confused cow. Space was so tight, you could shake hands with your neighbor without leaving bed, and many did, because whole families were crammed into single-room tenements that made sardine cans look spacious. Parks, you ask? Oh, those existed for the rich. St. James's Park, Hyde Park, and a few other green spaces were splendid, if you had the right hat, the right title, and the right accent. But for the working class, the nearest natural sight was the moss growing on your neighbor's roof. For the rest of society, there was simply nowhere to go that wasn't filthy, overcrowded, or flammable. So, where do you turn when you need fresh air and a little peace and quiet? Apparently, the passer-away had already figured it out. In the early 1800s, traditional church graveyards were overflowing, literally. Thanks to centuries of burials, some churchyards were packed so tightly with bodies that coffins poked up like stubborn roots. Diseases spread, smells lingered, and the whole system started to resemble a horror story wrapped in fog. Enter the solution, the garden cemetery. Starting in the 1830s, cities like London began building massive new burial grounds on the outskirts of town. These weren't just functional, they were designed to be beautiful. Highgate Cemetery, opened in 1839, became the poster child of this new movement. Winding paths, trimmed hedges, Gothic monuments and panoramic views. It was basically a passing-away-themed theme park. Kensal Green, Brompton and others followed, offering a picturesque alternative to being stuffed under a pub's floorboards. These new cemeteries weren't wedged between tenements or factories. They were purpose-built with space, air, and yes, benches. You could almost forget you were surrounded by the dearly departed. For many Victorians, these cemeteries became the only accessible, green and safe outdoor spaces within a carriage ride of home. It wasn't long before families started treating them like parks. They'd bring blankets, baskets and enough bread pudding to sustain an army. Children would play among the tombstones. Parents would read or nap under the shade of a weeping willow, while just a few feet away someone's Aunt Mildred slumbered eternally beneath a marble cherub. It sounds bizarre today, but at the time it made sense. These cemeteries were peaceful, carefully maintained, and compared to the rest of the city, shockingly clean. The passings didn't catcall, spill beer, or scream about turnips. In many ways they were the ideal neighbors, and if a loved one happened to be buried there, well, even better. Visiting Grandpa could be a multi-course affair. First a respectful flower placement, then a sandwich, then perhaps a light snooze while you waited for your uncle to stop sobbing into his waistcoat. Victorian society was obsessed with order, beauty, and symbolism, even when it came to passing away. Garden cemeteries embraced all three. The trees weren't just planted for shade, they had meanings: cypress for mourning, yew for immortality. The layout followed a romantic vision of the afterlife: calm, rolling hills, dappled sunlight, and birdsong echoing off marble angels. This made cemeteries not just places of grief, but places of philosophy. A well-timed graveyard stroll reminded you that life was short, art was eternal, and you should probably write more poetry before tuberculosis caught you by surprise. It wasn't unusual to see artists sketching headstones, couples strolling hand in hand, or writers furiously scribbling metaphors under a crypt. After all, nothing inspires creative angst like being reminded that time is an unstoppable bulldozer, and also that you forgot to bring a parasol. So yes, Victorians picnicked in cemeteries, but once you understand the gaslit labyrinth they lived in, it doesn't seem so strange. In a world full of coal smoke, noise, and public urination, a graveyard was a leafy sanctuary, a space to breathe, reflect, and chew on a sausage roll while contemplating mortality. And if a few squirrels scampered across someone's memorial plaque while you were at it, well, at least they weren't rats. By the mid-19th century, passing away wasn't just something you experienced, it was somewhere you visited, ideally with a parasol, a picnic basket, and a soft admiration for neoclassical statuary. While earlier graveyards had the aesthetic charm of a leftover potato field, cramped, grimy, and mostly perpendicular, Victorian reformers and city planners had a revolutionary idea: what if cemeteries weren't eyesores? What if instead they were beautiful? Welcome to the era of the garden cemetery, where the line between park and burial ground was so blurred, it was hard to tell whether you were mourning a relative or admiring the horticulture. Before this floral revolution, burial spaces were quite literally a mess. Urban churchyards were stuffed to capacity. Bodies were stacked like morbid lasagnas. The smell alone could haunt a building, and that's without counting the occasional, unintentional resurfacing of a dearly departed toe. But starting in the 1830s, thanks to the rising pressure from the public health movement and probably noses, cemeteries got an upgrade. Rather than cramming coffins into city churchyards like sardines in spiritual limbo, reformers advocated for large landscaped cemeteries on the outskirts of cities, spaces intentionally designed for both the passing and the living. Highgate Cemetery in London is one of the most iconic examples of this new philosophy. Opened in 1839, Highgate was built on the idea that burial grounds should be orderly, elegant, and, dare we say it, photogenic. With winding paths, Romanesque architecture, carefully planted trees, and romantic vistas, it became a destination for Victorians looking to do more than just cry discreetly into a lace handkerchief. It was where you went to contemplate mortality with style, preferably while sitting next to a marble lion guarding someone named Horace. What made garden cemeteries so different wasn't just the landscaping, it was the mindset behind them. Passing away, once a private affair marked by hastily dug graves and the occasional ominous raven, was now integrated into public life. These cemeteries were intentionally made to look like parks, not metaphorically, literally. They featured winding carriage roads, ornamental ponds, shady groves, and benches placed exactly where you'd want to sit and judge the mourning outfit of a passing widow. Statues of angels and cherubs added an air of peace, though the sheer number of urns might make you wonder if everyone had been cremated or just really liked vases. And people went, not just to grieve but to be, to stroll, to read, to sketch, to picnic. Cemeteries became date spots, family outing locations, and peaceful escapes from the chaos of industrial London. They were cleaner, greener, and vastly more relaxing than city parks, many of which didn't even exist yet or were still in the mud pit surrounded by factory smoke stage of development. These spaces also gave artists and architects something to show off. Mausoleums were no longer simple stone boxes, they were miniature palaces. Gothic arches stood side by side with Egyptian obelisks. Sculptors crafted heart-wrenching mourning figures and glorious memorials to men whose primary accomplishment was owned several railroads and a large moustache. The aesthetic mattered deeply to Victorians. After all, if you had to die, and you most certainly did, you might as well do it somewhere tastefully landscaped with ivy and sorrow. The popularity of these cemeteries also reflected changing religious views. While passing away was still a deeply spiritual event, the emphasis on eternal torment was giving way to softer ideas about peaceful rest and the beauty of remembrance. That made cemeteries feel less like pre-haunted properties and more like museums of memory. Quiet, reflective spaces that happened to come with an occasional crow for dramatic effect. Even the layout had meaning. Plots were designed with thought to the sun's position. Pathways guided you through emotional and spiritual journeys. And let's not forget the inscriptions. Victorians loved a good epitaph. There's nothing quite like enjoying a scone while reading something like, "Here lies Eliza, who obeyed her husband and now rests in peace." Whether it was heartfelt or slightly passive-aggressive, you had to admire the poetic commitment. So by the time people started treating these cemeteries like public parks, it wasn't really a surprise, it was the entire point. They were made to be visited, they were made to be admired, and in a world where public green space was rare and often poorly maintained, the idea of popping into the cemetery for an afternoon stroll didn't just make sense, it made perfect Victorian sense. Especially if you brought a flask and had a deep respect for funerary sculpture. The classic Victorian weekend, a brisk walk, a heartfelt prayer, and a heaping plate of cold meats next to Great Aunt Mildred's final resting place. For the Victorians, cemetery picnics weren't some creepy goth field trip or a morbid gag. They were good, clean family fun with a side of coleslaw. Passing away, after all, was just another branch on the family tree, and the cemetery, a perfectly lovely venue for your grandmother's famous gooseberry tart. So, what exactly happened during these strange Sunday outings to the land of eternal silence and carved angels? The answer: everything short of lawn darts and barbecue grills. Families packed wicker baskets brimming with boiled eggs, jam sandwiches, sponge cake, and bottles of ginger beer, then laid out blankets right next to family plots as if the dearly departed might sit up and ask for extra mustard. These weren't hasty, awkward affairs either. People made a day of it. Children would play among the headstones, carefully of course. Tripping over a crypt was considered bad manners, while parents and grandparents talked, laughed, reminisced, and yes, sometimes even sang hymns together. It wasn't uncommon to see someone reading aloud, whether from the Bible, a newspaper, or perhaps a popular poem by Tennyson, as the rest of the group listened, all while surrounded by serene, well-manicured grave sites. It sounds bizarre now, but Victorians genuinely believed in maintaining bonds with the passings. Visiting a grave wasn't just a gesture of grief, it was a continued relationship. Cemeteries weren't viewed as ghost-haunted horror shows, but as extensions of the family home. If you couldn't catch up with Cousin William over tea at his townhouse, the next best thing was chatting beside his tombstone over a scone. It wasn't just nuclear families either. These events often included multiple generations. Grandparents, parents, kids, and the odd melancholy bachelor uncle would all show up, sometimes dressed in black, sometimes not. Gathering together not out of morbidity but out of duty, love, and perhaps just a bit of boredom. Keep in mind, this was a world without television, internet, or even reliably clean public parks. So when the options were sit inside and count ceiling cracks, or have lunch in the one green place in town, cemeteries started to look pretty appealing. Even romantic couples weren't immune to the lure of the marble-carved dead. Young lovers might walk the paths between tombs, reading inscriptions aloud, and speculating on the tragic love stories that may have preceded them. In a society where overt displays of affection were frowned upon and courtship was stiffer than a starched collar, a cemetery stroll offered a rare bit of privacy and poetic ambience. Nothing gets the heart fluttering quite like reading Beloved Wife and Mother, 1824–1860, while holding hands under a gloomy oak. There were also more structured events held within cemeteries. Some churchyards or privately managed garden cemeteries hosted musical performances or public readings. Brass bands would sometimes play near the gates, offering a soundtrack that was one part reverent, one part summer picnic. People brought folding chairs and parasols not just for comfort, but because they knew they'd be there for hours. For many Victorians, this wasn't just an occasional activity, it was a ritual, a tradition, and in some cases, a social obligation. And don't assume everyone treated it solemnly. Children might weave daisy chains to leave on the graves. Families might pose for photographs. A curious practice that has left behind a treasure trove of black and white images featuring toddlers grinning next to obelisks and mothers in bonnets, balancing teacups near moss-covered crosses. Today, we'd call that a red flag. Back then it was a Sunday well spent. Food was central to the experience. Cold meats, pickled vegetables, fruitcake. It was like a Victorian potluck with the deceased as honorary guests. There was no fear of bad luck or evil spirits. If anything, the Victorians believed it was polite to include the dead in life's ongoing routine. Visiting their resting place kept the memory warm and the spirits content, sort of like checking in with a relative who's retired to the great beyond. In a way, cemetery picnics were the ultimate form of intergenerational bonding. They allowed families to acknowledge the permanence of passing away without shrinking from it. The tombstone didn't represent a full stop. It was more like a semicolon in the story of the family pausing for breath, but never ending the conversation. Ah yes, nothing says bon appetit quite like deviled eggs, and the looming presence of Great-Aunt Mildred's granite memorial watching over you. The Victorians, in all their lace-clad and stiff-collared glory, brought serious game to the art of outdoor dining, and that included when the outdoors were dotted with tombstones and lined with obelisks. Their cemetery picnics weren't just a matter of grabbing a sandwich and sitting cross-legged on the grass. No, this was an event, and they packed accordingly. Let's begin with the menu. If you were expecting something as emotionally bland as a protein bar or a sad ham sandwich, you're in the wrong century. Victorian picnic fare was an elaborate affair, at least for those who could afford it. You could count on the classic cucumber sandwiches, which were basically bread, butter, and slices of cucumber arranged with the precision of a military parade. Sponge cake was another favorite, often soaked in brandy or stacked high with whipped cream and fruit, because why not eat something decadent next to Uncle Jeffrey's eternal resting place? For the more carnivorous crowd, slices of cold beef, ham, or chicken were popular. Always served cold, of course, as nobody was dragging a grill through the headstones. You'd also find meat pies, Scotch eggs, and sausage rolls, which walked the line between hearty and may induce heartburn halfway through your reading of Tennyson. Add in some pickled onions, Stilton cheese, and perhaps a bottle of ginger beer or claret, and you've got yourself a feast worthy of both the living and, well, those who'd moved on. Now let's talk about the gear. Victorians did not rough it. There was no sitting on damp grass with ants crawling into your boots. They brought folding wooden chairs, embroidered picnic blankets, actual teapots, yes, porcelain ones, and even collapsible tables. One could only imagine the confusion of a passing squirrel encountering a fine china teacup perched on a headstone. These people turned a graveyard into a drawing room under the sky. Napkins were linen, not paper. Cutlery was silver, not plastic. And forget about red solo cups. Wine was sipped from glass goblets, because even in the presence of decay and mortality, one must maintain standards. The Victorian idea of going out for lunch involved more effort than most modern weddings. There was a certain etiquette to all of this too, because of course there was. One didn't just plop themselves down next to a random tomb and start munching on roast chicken. Ideally, the plot belonged to a family member, someone whose memory was being honored with sponge cake and small talk. Picnics were often paired with a bit of light grave tending. People would clean up the headstone, leave flowers, or sit and chat with their dearly departed, like they were catching up over coffee. We brought your favorite Edith, lemon tart, and everyone's crippling emotional repression. Music was sometimes involved. A portable harmonium wasn't out of the question. Neither was poetry reading, sketching the scenery, or a quiet moment of reflection interrupted only by the sound of a boiled sweet being unwrapped. Some families brought books or newspapers. Children would play nearby because, yes, graveyards doubled as Victorian playgrounds. Nothing says carefree childhood like hide and seek behind a mausoleum. It's also worth noting that the class divide still loomed over these activities. Upper-class families could afford elaborate spreads and looked like a watercolor painting come to life. Working-class families might bring simpler fare, but the sentiment remained. Cemeteries were peaceful, spacious and free, a rare trifecta in Victorian urban life. A day spent among the dead was, paradoxically, a way to feel alive, connected and comforted. All of this combined into a rather surreal tableau, families dining in silence, sipping tea next to statues of mourning angels and marble urns, the sounds of laughter, clinking cutlery and birdsong rising through the trees while the stone faces of the departed looked on. It was, in its way, a fusion of the sacred and the mundane, a place to grieve, yes, but also a place to be. So the next time you toss a bag of chips into your backpack for a picnic, just remember, the Victorians brought 6 courses, a tablecloth, and enough tea to caffeinate an opera house, and they did it all with passing away literally at their feet, and not a single paper plate in sight. When you think of candlelit romance, you probably imagine a quaint bistro, a violin playing softly in the background, and not, say, a looming crypt in the corner and a strong scent of moss. But in the Victorian era, cemeteries weren't just for grief, they were for wooing. If you happened to find true love while perched on a stone bench near a mausoleum, well, congratulations, you've just experienced peak 19th century vibes. Because nothing quite said marry me, like holding hands under the watchful eye of a marble cherub and a few thousand departed souls. The Victorians, ever the masters of making the macabre fashionable, managed to turn cemeteries into part of their dating scene. A walk through the tombstones wasn't morbid, it was meaningful. You could bond over mutual ancestors, shared favorite poets, and maybe even your top 5 epitaphs. Cemeteries offered quiet, greenery, and the kind of privacy that was nearly impossible to find in overcrowded Victorian cities, especially if your parents insisted on chaperoning every stroll down the street. In a graveyard you could wander among the oaks and monuments, safe from the judging eye of Aunt Mildred and her embroidery club. Imagine a young couple on a Sunday afternoon, she in a modest bustle dress, he with the world's stiffest collar and the world's sweatiest palms. The two of them stroll arm in arm through winding cemetery paths, passing grand marble memorials and ivy-covered tombs, reciting poetry as they go. If that sounds goth, it's because it was. Victorian society practically invented the aesthetic long before black eyeliner existed. Byron, Shelley and Keats weren't just required reading, they were emotional support literature. Nothing stirred the teenage heart quite like verses about doomed love and moonlit cemeteries, and where better to read them than a literal moonlit cemetery. But romance was only one part of the social stew being brewed among the headstones. Bond cemeteries were also prime territory for storytelling, and not just the once-upon-a-time kind. We're talking ghost stories, chilling tales of mysterious noises, unexplained lights, and the occasional revenant dragging chains through the rhododendrons. These stories were passed around with as much enthusiasm as cucumber sandwiches. Children swapped spooky tales the way modern kids swap memes. Teenagers dared each other to visit the more shadowy corners. Adults, meanwhile, tried to look dignified while clearly checking over their shoulders every 5 minutes. Spiritualism, too, played a major role. In an age when seances were held in parlors and table rapping was a legitimate hobby, Belief in the afterlife wasn't confined to Sunday sermons. Many Victorians truly believed that the veil between the living and the dead was as thin as a teacup saucer. A cemetery wasn't just a place for the past, it was a possible gateway to the beyond. If your romantic outing happened to include a casual attempt to commune with Great Uncle Harold, well, that just added ambience. This blending of life and death created a cultural cocktail that was equal parts eerie and endearing. Cemeteries allowed the youth of the era a safe, respectable place to flirt without scandal, and with just enough spookiness to keep things interesting. You weren't just impressing your sweetheart with your literary taste, you were proving you were brave enough to walk by the grave of mad old Mrs. Trenwith after sundown. Of course, it helped that these garden cemeteries were designed to be beautiful. With curated trees, meandering paths, and artistic tombs, they had all the charm of a landscaped park with just a touch of eternity. If you weren't careful, you might momentarily forget it was a cemetery at all, until a raven landed dramatically on a headstone and reminded you that you were indeed picnicking next to the dearly departed. It's easy for us to raise an eyebrow at this today. We've drawn sharp lines between life and death, play and grief, picnics and the paranormal, but to the Victorians, this mingling of the romantic and the morbid was entirely natural. It reflected their philosophical comfort with mortality and their flair for theatrical emotions. In short, if you were going to fall in love, why not do it somewhere with both roses and reminders of your inevitable demise? Nothing says carpe diem like whispering sweet nothings while a raven caws in the background. So the next time you see an old photo of a lace-clad couple smiling faintly beside a tombstone, know this: they weren't being ironic. They were living and loving in a time when cemeteries weren't creepy, they were courtly. In the Victorian era, education wasn't just about arithmetic and the occasional Latin declension. No, it was also about knowing your place in the grand scheme of existence, which, according to the average cemetery inscription, was about 6 feet underground and probably surrounded by relatives who also died of consumption. For Victorians, graveyards weren't simply resting places for the dearly departed. They were open-air classrooms where death taught the ultimate syllabus: mortality, morality, and manners. A trip to the cemetery could serve the same purpose as a Sunday sermon, a school lesson, and a grim fairy tale, all bundled into one rather damp family outing. Imagine a mother in crinoline and bonnet leading her children through a row of headstones, pointing with one gloved hand and saying, "Here lies little Emily. She died at age 5 because she didn't wear her shawl." Whether that story was true or not was beside the point. The message was clear: behave, dress modestly, don't sass your elders, and never forget your umbrella. Victorians, with their flair for moral storytelling and their obsession with legacy, used epitaphs like educational flashcards. Tombstone inscriptions ranged from the stern, "Prepare to meet thy God," to the sentimental, "Gone but not forgotten," to the aggressively poetic, "She hath gone to dwell with angels bright." Children would be encouraged, perhaps even required, to read them aloud and reflect. "See," a father might say after his son stumbled through an elaborate epitaph, "that's what happens when you get trampled by a carriage after ignoring your mother's warning." Reading the stones wasn't just a literacy exercise, it was a life lesson carved in granite. Passing away was not a taboo subject for children, quite the opposite. It was something to be faced head-on, sometimes literally, while nibbling on a biscuit. The Victorians believed that exposing children early to the reality of death created moral fortitude and a sense of spiritual purpose. Graveyards provided not only the final chapter of many lives but also a sort of curriculum vitae of how to live righteously. In an age when childhood mortality was tragically common, sheltering children from passing away would have seemed both impractical and unwise. Best to familiarize them with the concept before they had to confront it directly. This wasn't just about fear either. Victorian graveyards often tried to present passing away as a transition rather than an end. Angels carved in white marble stood sentinel beside children's graves, offering the promise of a heavenly reunion. Little lambs adorned the tombstones of infants, suggesting innocence and peace. This blend of heartbreak and hope became a visual language that children learned to interpret as fluently as nursery rhymes. A stroll through the cemetery taught not only that life was fragile, but that goodness, piety, and obedience were the best armor against its unpredictability, even if it wasn't guaranteed to work. Cemetery visits were also excellent opportunities for lessons in etiquette and proper public behavior. Children were expected to walk quietly, speak respectfully, and dress appropriately, as if the dead were watching and would absolutely report your conduct to the afterlife authorities. You didn't climb on tombstones or play hide and seek among the monuments, at least not while the adults were watching. The cemetery, despite its recreational use, remained a sacred space. That kind of dual messaging. This is a park, but also the gateway to eternity was very on brand for Victorian society. And let's not forget the power of comparison as a teaching tool. Parents could point to an impressive obelisk and say, "That's what a life of industry and moral virtue gets you." Then turn to a cracked, unlabeled stone and add, "And that's what happens if you run away to join the circus." Gravestones were not just memorials, they were moral report cards set in stone. In a modern context, the idea of taking your kids to a cemetery for an afternoon of character development might raise a few eyebrows or trigger a call to Child Protective Services. But in Victorian times, it was a perfectly reasonable, even noble endeavour. In fact, it was a practice that fit neatly into the broader Victorian project of using every available moment, no matter how macabre, as a chance to shape young minds into properly restrained, God-fearing adults. The belief that cemeteries could instruct, inspire, and instill good behaviour shows just how far the Victorians were willing to go to ensure their children understood not just the alphabet, but the ultimate end of the sentence. A graveyard visit wasn't meant to scare, it was meant to prepare, and if it came with a slice of sponge cake afterward, all the better. If you think of a cemetery as a place only for whispers and sorrowful sniffles, you're clearly not on Victorian wavelength. In the 19th century, the average British graveyard was less gloom and doom, and more bring the family, the dog, and your opera glasses. Yes, the same plots that held dearly departed Aunt Mildred were also prime locations for open-air sermons, community gatherings, and occasionally someone reciting Wordsworth with dramatic flair while standing next to a mausoleum. In short, the Victorians turned cemeteries into full-on cultural venues where the living came to engage, reflect, and be, well, a little extra. Part of this graveyard as stage concept stemmed from the same philosophical ideals that made garden cemeteries so fashionable. The Victorians didn't just want a functional resting place, they wanted somewhere aesthetically inspiring and spiritually edifying. After all, why waste a perfectly sculpted angel statue and a grove of whispering elms on silence? If you're going to reflect on mortality, why not do it while listening to a baritone sing Ave Maria? One of the most popular events in these cemeteries was the open-air sermon. Church services weren't confined to stuffy chapels with bad ventilation and pew splinters. On pleasant Sundays, ministers would set up a portable pulpit among the graves, and congregations would gather with folding stools, parasols, and hymn books. Picture it, a sea of black silken bonnets swaying gently to the rhythm of sacred hymns, while perched between marble headstones. It was faith with a view, and sometimes a light breeze that tried to turn the prayer page for you. And this wasn't some fringe activity. Churches often coordinated these services in partnership with the cemetery's board, viewing it as a perfect way to promote both piety and public use of the grounds. After all, a graveyard visit could be a spiritual experience even without the formality of mourning, sort of like passing away, but make it Sunday brunch appropriate. Of course, it wasn't all religious reverence. Cemeteries hosted literary readings, musical performances, and even historical lectures. Yes, the Victorians invented cemetery talks. Authors and poets might perform beneath the trees, letting their voices bounce off the granite tombs and statues. Children gathered to hear ghost stories read aloud as the sun dipped below the horizon, all while trying not to look too hard at the crypt behind them. If you're wondering whether there was a niche for Gothic-themed public entertainment, the answer is a coffin-lined absolutely. Music was another major draw. Small orchestras and choirs occasionally performed in well-known cemeteries, treating audiences to sacred tunes, classical sonatas, or stirring choral renditions of Nearer My God to Thee, ironically upbeat considering the setting. Some choirs even rehearsed there because of the acoustics. Who needs a concert hall when you've got a granite columbarium and a natural amphitheatre built by weeping willow trees? Victorian passing away tourism also played a surprising role in these public gatherings. As cities grew more industrial and polluted, cemeteries remained green, peaceful refuges, and many people took casual strolls through them simply because they were prettier than most parks. Tour guides would lead visitors through the rows of graves, recounting the lives and deaths of famous figures, or pointing out curious epitaphs and funerary art. If you were really lucky or just morbidly curious, you might get a guided explanation of how embalming worked, or a detailed look at the more creative ways people tried not to be buried alive. And then there were the special events, annual ceremonies to honor war dead, commemorative processions for poets or scientists, and occasionally a very somber Victorian version of a flash mob, which still involved a lot of black lace and polite clapping. Local newspapers even advertised these events, encouraging families to come early and bring lunch, because no Victorian outing was complete without a pot of jam and a judgmental glance at someone else's cravat. The atmosphere was a curious mix, reverent, celebratory, a little spooky, and deeply communal. Cemeteries weren't just for grieving, they were also for remembering, and for many Victorians that meant doing so with music, conversation, and a well-dressed turnout. It's hard to imagine today's cemetery etiquette allowing for a cello solo and a group picnic, but to the Victorians it was simply the proper way to honor life, death, and everything in between. It was fun while it lasted. Well, if your idea of fun includes lemon tarts beside headstones and hymns echoing off obelisks. But by the early 20th century, the grand tradition of cemetery picnicking and public performances among the dearly departed had begun to pack up its parasol. The marble amphitheatre fell quiet. The cold roast chicken stayed home, and Victorians' rather unique love affair with graveyard leisure finally gave way to something far less skeletal: modern parks, evolving social norms, and the growing sense that maybe sandwiches and skeletons shouldn't share the same space. The first major shift came with changes in how society viewed passing away itself. While the Victorians had practically turned mourning into an Olympic sport, complete with rules, costumes, and endurance training, the early 20th century brought a wave of emotional and practical distancing from passing away. Gone were the elaborate mourning rituals, the post-mortem photographs, and the obsession with last words. Death became more clinical, more private, and decidedly less picnic-friendly. The cemetery was no longer a destination, it was a necessity, best visited briefly, solemnly, and preferably with minimal eye contact. This shift was driven in part by 2 world wars, which introduced a level of mass death that the average person could no longer romanticize. Mourning went from performative to deeply personal. People stopped carving poetic epitaphs and started favoring clean, simple headstones. The cemetery as a social space slowly became a cemetery as a silent one. But it wasn't just death that changed. Life did too. The Industrial Revolution, which had initially driven families to the edge of town for a bit of green space, even if it was filled with coffins, had by the 20th century finally delivered on its promise of urban public parks. And lo and behold, these new parks came with 0 bodies beneath the grass. Suddenly, you could picnic, stroll, or host a string quartet without having to explain to your child why that statue has angel wings and no feet. Thanks to figures like Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect behind New York's Central Park and other major urban green spaces, cities began investing in purpose-built recreational areas. Parks had playgrounds, fountains, and flower beds instead of tombs, crypts, and questionable memento mori sculptures. Families now had a legitimate alternative to the cemetery picnic, and this new setting didn't come with the possibility of sitting on someone's grandfather. Add to that the rise of secularism, and the picture gets even clearer. As religious influence slowly loosened its grip on public life, The idea of finding spiritual or philosophical comfort among gravestones lost its shine. No longer did people feel the need to be surrounded by symbols of mortality to reflect on the meaning of life. They could just go to a museum, or a tea room, or quite literally anywhere that wasn't directly above a coffin. By mid-century, most of the performances, tours and musical affairs in cemeteries had either moved to indoor venues or vanished entirely. Cemeteries, once designed as places of beauty and congregation, were now overgrown, underfunded, and slowly slipping into obscurity. The term passing away tourism no longer meant a family outing. It was now more associated with morbid curiosity or spooky Halloween specials. And perhaps the final nail in the coffin, pun very much intended, was the growing discomfort around food and funerals. By the 1950s and 60s, Western culture had begun to sanitize the experience of passing away, hiding it behind hospital curtains and funeral parlor doors. The once proud cemetery picnic now seemed inappropriate. The very idea of spreading a checkered blanket next to a gravestone and enjoying a ham sandwich began to feel like social heresy. Passing away had been moved out of view both figuratively and literally, and society preferred it that way. Of course, echoes of the old tradition remain. Some historic cemeteries host occasional tours or cultural events, usually with a heavy side of education to justify the outing. And in recent years there's even been a tiny revival of interest in green burials and re-engaging with passing away in more holistic ways. But let's be honest, nobody's lining up to host a bridal shower in a graveyard anymore. So why did the dead dinner party die? Because the world changed. People no longer needed cemeteries for leisure, learning or leafy afternoon outings. They had parks, museums, theatres and spas for that. And maybe, just maybe, they decided that their egg salad sandwich tasted better without being in eyeshot of a Victorian angel holding an urn. And thus ends the tale of how cemeteries went from ghostly picnic spots to solemn, silent spaces, a uniquely Victorian chapter in our social history, full of lace, grief and finger foods, now buried, quite appropriately, in the past. If Antarctica had a restraining order to file, Sir Ernest Shackleton would have violated it about 12 times before breakfast. Most people flirt with danger once, maybe twice. Shackleton, he took danger on candlelit expeditions, carved its name into the ice, and serenaded it with bagpipes in a snowstorm. Born in 1874 in County Kildare, Ireland, Ernest Shackleton was not raised in the frosty arms of the wilderness. In fact, he grew up in the milder climes of London's suburbia, which makes his lifelong obsession with freezing to death all the more confusing. Maybe it was rebellion, maybe it was destiny, or maybe he just really hated being warm. From a young age, Shackleton was fascinated by the sea. He joined the merchant navy at 16, not because he needed to escape anything, but because clearly the idea of school or stable employment bored him to tears. Over the next several years, he became a certified master mariner, a title that sounds impressive until you remember that it basically means guy who passed the test and didn't sink anything important. Still, it was this maritime background that eventually got him noticed by the great Antarctic explorer of the time, Robert Falcon Scott, a man whose name sounds like a hawk in a waistcoat. In 1901, Scott invited Shackleton to join the Discovery Expedition, the British Empire's first major scientific poke at Antarctica. This trip was, for lack of a better word, cold. The men spent 2 years studying penguins, measuring snow and getting scurvy. Shackleton, ever the team player, helped haul supplies across miles of ice using his own limbs, since sled dogs were about as cooperative as toddlers on strike. Eventually, his health deteriorated so badly, a winning combo of frostbite, exhaustion, and the 1900s version of "You Look Awful," that Scott had him sent home early. Most men would have taken the hint. Shackleton, he took it personally. Thus began the saga of the Nimrod expedition. No, really, that was its name. Launched in 1907, the expedition was Shackleton's own effort to outdo his former boss, and perhaps show Antarctica who was in charge now. Spoiler alert, still Antarctica. The goal? Reach the South Pole. The plan? A little shaky. The optimism? Blinding. The Nimrod expedition didn't have the budget of the more official expeditions, but what it lacked in funding, it made up for in sheer stubborn enthusiasm. Shackleton managed to secure a ship, a crew, some ponies. Yes, ponies, because nothing screams polar survival like confused equines from Siberia, and enough supplies to last until the next heroic failure. He sailed south, established a base at Cape Royds, and set out with a small party toward the pole. No one had done it before. He was ready to make history or freeze trying. The journey was brutal. The temperatures made your thoughts shiver. The wind had a personal vendetta. The food ran low. The ponies dropped dead, unsurprisingly, and yet Shackleton kept pushing forward with the quiet confidence of a man who thought sheer willpower could melt glaciers. And maybe it almost did. In January 1909, they reached 88°23 south, just 97 nautical miles from the South Pole, the closest any humans had ever been. But instead of pressing on and gambling everyone's lives for the sake of a flag and a photograph, Shackleton did the unthinkable. He turned back. That's right. Faced with the deadliest terrain on Earth and running on half a biscuit and 2 toenails, Shackleton made the call, survival over glory. It was the single most rational decision he ever made, and somehow it made him a legend. He didn't win. He didn't reach the pole, but he also didn't die, which in Antarctic terms counts as a resounding success. When he got home, the public greeted him not as a failure, but as a hero with good judgment and better facial hair. But did Shackleton use this near-death experience as a reason to retire? Oh no, that's not how obsession works. Shackleton treated Antarctica like an ex he just couldn't quit. She was cold, distant, and tried to kill him every time they met. But my God, was she beautiful. Instead of letting the ice keep its secrets, he went back to plotting another grand expedition, one that would cross the entire continent, one that would finally seal his place in history, one that would go horribly, horribly wrong. This was a man whose charisma could charm aristocrats and coal-stokers alike. He made people believe in impossible things like surviving a trek across Antarctica or sailing through a hurricane in a lifeboat. He was confident, persuasive, and just the right amount of reckless. He wasn't the best scientist. He wasn't even the best planner, but he was the best at making people follow him to the ends of the earth and then somehow bringing them back again. Every time he nearly died, he thought, well, that could have gone worse. And Antarctica thought, he'll be back. Spoiler alert, he would be. In 1914, while the rest of Europe was bracing for war, Sir Ernest Shackleton was busy planning something arguably even more dangerous, a relaxing stroll across the entire continent of Antarctica. Not around it, not near it, across it, from sea to frozen sea. Roughly 1,800 miles of solid ice, lethal temperatures, and moods that fluctuated between frostbite and existential despair. Why did he want to do this? Because Roald Amundsen had already beaten everyone to the South Pole in 1911, leaving Shackleton, who had previously gotten within a heartbreakingly close 97 nautical miles, without a world record to his name. The new goal? Cross the continent entirely, do something even Amundsen hadn't done, and look heroic while doing it. The first step in this grand plan: recruit a crew willing to risk their lives for vague glory, weak pay, and the possibility of being eaten by their bunkmate. Now, there's a long-standing rumor that Shackleton posted a classified ad reading, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success." Is this ad real? Historians debate it. Does it feel like something Shackleton would have done? Oh, absolutely. If nothing else, it's brutally honest marketing. At least he didn't promise hot meals or dental care. In reality, Shackleton received over 5,000 applications for just 28 spots. That's a rejection rate worthy of Ivy League schools. Among the hopefuls were experienced sailors, adventure-hungry aristocrats, unemployed dreamers, and one man who applied with nothing but a note that read, "I am willing to go anywhere." Shackleton, charmed by the sheer desperation, brought him on. And here's the thing. Shackleton didn't necessarily hire the most qualified, he hired the ones with the right attitude. According to multiple accounts, he judged men by their handshakes, eye contact, humor, and yes, facial hair. A good beard meant you could survive, or at least look like you were surviving. One applicant was asked if he could sing. When he said yes, he got the job. Antarctic qualifications: warm voice, strong lungs, doesn't panic when your tent collapses in a blizzard. He assembled an eclectic team. Frank Worsley, a New Zealand-born captain who could navigate by starlight and vibes. Tom Crean, an Irish veteran of previous polar expeditions, known for being unkillable and perpetually cheerful. George Marston, the expedition's official artist, who must have had a death wish and a really good set of watercolors. Harry McNish, a carpenter who brought logic, tools, and a cat. Oh yes, the cat, named Mrs. Chippy. Despite the name, Mrs. Chippy was male, a fact that surprised everyone, including the cat. He belonged to McNish and quickly became a beloved member of the crew, inspecting the deck daily and treating the icy ship like his own private kingdom. He would later become the symbol of all that was warm and good and whiskered in a world of relentless cold. Now about the ship. Endurance. She was a beauty, built in Norway, triple-layered with oak, and designed to withstand polar punishment. Her original name had been Polaris, but Shackleton renamed her Endurance, after his family motto, "By endurance we conquer," which is poetic, and also a bit ironic, considering what would happen next. She was a marvel of wooden engineering, reinforced bow, powerful steam engine, and accommodations that almost bordered on cozy, provided you didn't mind shared bunks, questionable stew, and the occasional gale force wind howling through your soul. But no amount of craftsmanship could prepare her for what she was about to endure. Spoiler: naming a ship. Endurance doesn't make it immortal. It just makes its destruction more tragic in retrospect. The crew set sail from London to Buenos Aires in August 1914, right as World War I broke out. Shackleton even offered to delay the expedition and serve the war effort. But Winston Churchill himself told him to press on, because what the British Empire needed more than soldiers, apparently, was a man heading into a frozen wasteland with some sled dogs and a dream. And yes, there were dogs, lots of them, giant, howling, slobbering dogs, each with names like Satan, Hercules, and Suggen. Some were born fighters, others were born nap enthusiasts. All of them were about to become deeply unimpressed with human leadership. By the time the Endurance reached the sub-Antarctic island of South Georgia for final prep, Shackleton had assembled one of the strangest, toughest, most sleep-deprived teams ever to set foot on a doomed expedition. Because, as it turns out, he wasn't looking for textbook explorers. He didn't need sailors. He needed people who wouldn't scream when the ship exploded. If Antarctic exploration were a job interview, Shackleton was the boss who ignored resumes and hired based on who looked like they'd win a bar fight with a snowstorm. And so, with the decks scrubbed, the dogs barking, and Mrs. Chippy probably judging everyone from the railing, the Endurance sailed into the unknown. Heroism was optional. Survival was not guaranteed. As far as job descriptions go, this one should have just read, "Wanted men for freezing misery." Survival optional. The plan was bold. The vision was grand. The execution? Tragically, stationary. In December 1914, with the crew fully stocked, and the Endurance proudly slicing through the icy waters of the Weddell Sea, Shackleton's dream of glory seemed just one continent away. Spirits were high, the weather was decent by Antarctic standards, and nobody had frostbite yet, which by polar standards was practically a victory parade. But as any seasoned explorer, or anyone who's ever tried to go for a quick hike in a blizzard will tell you, Antarctica doesn't play nice. It doesn't play fair. In fact, it doesn't play at all. It just crushes things. In mid-January 1915, about a month into their journey, the Endurance met its unexpected nemesis, pack ice. It sounds harmless, almost festive, like something you'd find next to a polar bear-shaped ice sculpture at a Christmas party. But in reality, it's a moving prison, made of razor-sharp chunks of sea ice, compressed by ocean currents and colder than your ex's last text message. One day the ship was making steady progress. The next day, stuck, frozen in place. The wind shifted, the ice closed around her, and suddenly, Endurance wasn't so much a vessel of progress as it was a very fancy wooden popsicle. The ship had been caught, clamped, and immobilized like a bug in a glacial spiderweb. And here's the kicker: the crew didn't panic, at least not openly. After all, this was Shackleton's hand-picked dream team, the kind of men who measured their stress levels in how many biscuits they could still ration. So, when the Endurance stopped moving, they did what any British-led expedition would do in a crisis. They made tea. Then they had a meeting. "We shall winter in the pack," Shackleton declared, in the kind of calm, confident voice that says this is fine, while the universe lights itself on fire behind him. It's important to understand what that sentence actually meant. They were now, officially, camping inside a wooden ship frozen into a slab of ice the size of Wales, with no way to move, and no way out, and no cell service. Progress halted. Ambitions on ice. The grand trans-Antarctic crossing had become a 10-month episode of Waiting for Movement, featuring your hosts, slowly starving humans, 70 annoyed dogs, and one increasingly judgmental cat. Now, you might think being trapped on a frozen sea with no escape would be a bit of a downer. And you'd be right. But here's the miracle. They stayed sane. Mostly. Shackleton understood something very few leaders grasp. In extreme conditions, morale is oxygen. Without it, people crack, panic, and start eyeing each other as potential meatloaf. So he did what any bold, frostbitten optimist would do. He turned the ship into a floating social club. By day they maintained routines, sled dog care, scientific observations, ship maintenance, even though the ship wasn't going anywhere, and long walks, also known as stomping in circles until your toes return from the void. By night, entertainment. They staged talent shows, concerts, and mock trials, usually convicting someone for imaginary crimes like excessive snoring or hoarding jam. They played soccer on the ice, which sounds charming until you realize the goalposts were snow piles and the penalty for tripping could be a concussion. They even put on theatrical plays, donning costumes made of canvas and whalebone, because nothing says mentally stable like performing Shakespeare in -20 Dewar the Frozen Moustache. Meanwhile, Frank Hurley, the expedition's photographer, became the crew's unofficial documentarian and occasional ice funk therapist. He captured hauntingly beautiful photos of the Endurance trapped in twilight, bathed in moonlight like a shipwreck in slow motion. Because, well, it was a shipwreck in slow motion. Everyone kept a journal too, not just for posterity, but because writing things down helped people stay grounded when reality started to wobble. Some wrote poetry, some doodled, some chronicled every single biscuit eaten, because hey, if your ship is stuck in a frozen sea with no hope of moving, at least you'll know who took the last sardine. As the months dragged on, so did the ship's fate. The ice wasn't just holding her, it was crushing her. Every groan of timber sounded like a warning shot. The hull creaked, splintered and twisted under pressure. The Endurance was fighting a battle she could never win, and everyone knew it. Still, the crew held fast. Some even referred to her as a home, albeit one trying to murder them in their sleep via hull implosion. By October 1915, 10 months in, Shackleton made an unspoken transition from explorer to survivalist. The expedition was no longer about crossing a continent. It was about not dying on a floating coffin in the middle of nowhere. And yet, through it all, he kept morale high. Mostly by not eating the crew, a simple yet effective management strategy. At one point, a crewman wrote, "We have not advanced 1 mile, yet somehow we are still in motion inside ourselves," which is a poetic way of saying we're still alive, but if this ice doesn't move soon, I may lose it and start talking to the stove. You know it's bad when your big travel achievement is becoming an ice popsicle, but as grim as things were, the real disaster hadn't even started yet. Because Endurance, brave, frozen, creaky Endurance, wasn't going to survive much longer, and neither were the comforts of indoor freezing. There's a moment in every slow-motion disaster when optimism quietly packs its bags and leaves. For the crew of the Endurance, that moment came on October 27, 1915, when the ship gave a loud, crunching groan and then began to die. Let's be clear, ships aren't supposed to make sounds like a tree being wrestled by a bear, but that's exactly what the Endurance sounded like as the Antarctic pack ice finally crushed its hull, with the subtlety of a trash compactor from a nightmare. For months, the Endurance had been frozen in place, drifting with the ice like a sad wooden raft on a glacier's Tinder profile, swiped left by fate over and over again. But now the ice wasn't just holding her, it was squeezing, pressing, and finally cracking her like a frozen walnut. Shackleton, who had stubbornly held on to the dream of a transcontinental crossing, like a man clinging to an unpaid invoice, finally admitted the obvious. They weren't going to walk across Antarctica. They weren't going to sail across it either. And very soon they might not even be standing on anything solid. He gave the order, abandon ship, and just like that, the grand expedition officially transformed into Don't Die, Extended Edition. The men scrambled into action. They hauled out supplies, sleds, tents, food rations, navigational tools, scientific instruments, and crucially, the lifeboats, 3 of them named James Caird, Dudley Docker, and Stancomb Wills, which all sound like underfunded British law firms but would soon become the closest things they had to salvation. It was chaos, but organized chaos, like a moving day in hell. Imagine trying to relocate your entire life off a collapsing cruise ship onto a slab of drifting ice, while the walls explode and the floor tries to eat you. That's the vibe. They pitched tents on the ice next to the carcass of the Endurance, which slowly splintered apart like a haunted treehouse under pressure. And still, Shackleton kept the men focused. No panic, no drama, just a calm urgency, the kind that says, yes, we've lost our ship, but on the bright side, at least we still have canned pemmican and mild frostbite. Now, it's worth noting just how British some of the reactions were. Photographer Frank Hurley, for instance, risked his life to wade back into the wreckage of the ship to save his glass negatives, hundreds of them. Imagine nearly freezing to death while whispering, "This one has such nice composition." That's commitment. Meanwhile, the crew set up what became known as Ocean Camp, which sounds like a charming summer getaway, but was really a patch of melting ice with unpredictable cracks, sub-zero temperatures, and daily reminders that they were now officially shipwrecked. Still, Shackleton kept up morale. He moved men around the camp with purpose. He checked on everyone personally. He told jokes, stayed alert, and pretended like sleeping on a disintegrating glacier was all part of the plan. Of course, pretending is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. The truth was, they had no idea what the next move was. One thing was certain, the Weddell Sea was not about to let them walk to safety. They were trapped, adrift on an unpredictable flow, surrounded by an ever-shifting minefield of icebergs, pressure ridges, and frozen disappointment. They had lost their ship, their original mission, and the last trace of hope that this might somehow turn into a grand heroic voyage. What they hadn't lost, miraculously, was their sense of humor. Someone joked that they'd become the South Polar Picnic Club. Another crew member, peering at their 3 lifeboats, mused whether one should be renamed the Floating Coffin. One wrote in his diary, "The ship is gone, the dogs are restless, and I've run out of new ways to describe the color white." It wasn't so much a cruise as a slow-motion disaster with snacks. Shackleton, however, kept his head. He knew despair could creep in if people sat still too long. So he made work the antidote. Every day had purpose. Ice patrols, gear checks, seal hunts, dog feeding, cooking rotations. If you weren't busy, you were next in line to get anxious, and Shackleton wasn't about to let anyone spiral. At one point, a group tried to walk toward Paulet Island, over 300 miles away, where a previous expedition had once built a shelter and left supplies. After days of trudging over unstable ice, they made it roughly 10 miles. Antarctica had a cruel habit of melting underneath your plans. So back to Ocean Camp they went. Then the Endurance, now barely upright in her ice coffin, gave her final death rattle. On November 2015, the ship slid beneath the ice and disappeared. No Titanic fanfare, no orchestra playing, just a quiet, creaking farewell to a ship that had done her best and lost. All that remained above the surface now was a crew of 28 men, 3 lifeboats, 1 disgruntled carpenter, a few dozen half-wild sled dogs, and Shackleton's unbreakable refusal to die stupidly. Step 1. Sail to Antarctica. Step 2. Lose ship. Step 3. Profit. Not quite, but the real test was only just beginning. They weren't explorers anymore. They were survivors. When your luxury cruise turns into a slow-motion apocalypse, you have 2 options: scream into the void or build a tent on it. After the Endurance was politely pulverized by the Weddell Sea, Shackleton and his now shipless crew were forced to accept a deeply humbling fact. Their address was now middle of nowhere, floating on ice, please send cocoa. Thus began their new residence on drifting ice floes, a real estate category rarely featured in travel brochures unless you're a SEAL. The men had nowhere else to go. The nearest bit of land was hundreds of miles away, and getting there required, well, anything but standing still. So they did the only thing left. They turned the slow-motion tragedy into a floating campsite of desperation and dog hair. And speaking of dogs, brace yourself for the part of the story that breaks every dog lover's heart in half with a frost-bitten ice pick. But first, the vibe. Imagine pitching a tent on a moving ice cube that's slowly cracking apart like your sanity. Add in unrelenting wind, sub-zero temperatures, and the ever-present sound of ice groaning beneath your boots like nature muttering, "You shouldn't be here." This was Camp Ocean Hell, where daily activities included trying not to fall into the sea, shivering competitively, and watching your dinner bark at you. For weeks the crew drifted on these slabs of shifting ice, hoping, praying for a break in the weather, the ice or the cosmic joke that had become their lives. They ate seal meat, penguin meat, and when even that ran low, well, let's just say Mrs. Chippy the cat didn't make it past Act 1, and the sled dogs were soon no longer sledding. This wasn't just survival. It was culinary Russian roulette with a side of tears. The emotional low point hit like a snowball to the soul. Shackleton, with the weight of keeping 27 lives intact, made the gut-wrenching call to shoot the dogs. They couldn't afford to feed them, and dragging them along would have made things worse. So the bond forged between man and beast during those long frosty nights ended with a gunshot and a silent nod toward necessity. One sailor reportedly cried more for Mrs. Chippy than for the Endurance. Fair enough. The ship didn't purr. Meanwhile, the crew had one job: stay alive and keep moving. When the ice cracked, they packed up camp in minutes, tents, gear, whatever half-frozen optimism they still had, and jumped to the next slab like particularly desperate game show contestants. Sleep was brief, often wet, and always cold. Shared sleeping bags became the ultimate test of friendship and tolerance for another man's icy toes. Yet somehow morale didn't crumble. Why? Because Shackleton wouldn't let it. His greatest tool wasn't a compass or a map. It was morale management, weaponized. He knew exactly who needed a pat on the back, who needed a kick in the pants, and when to swap those two around for maximum effect. He kept the men busy with chores, duties, anything to fight the creeping dread that their hotel had no exit and the heating had been turned off permanently. Humor was currency, and Shackleton encouraged it. Tall tales, singing, even a makeshift newspaper. The South Polar Times kept minds off the cold and their increasingly inventive menus. You know you've hit rock bottom when someone tries to make seal au jus sound gourmet. The psychological strain was as dangerous as the physical one. Every crack in the ice was a reminder of their fragility. Every gust of wind a whispered reminder, you're not supposed to be here. The fact that not one man lost his sanity is either a testament to Shackleton's leadership or a sign that insanity just got bored and wandered off. Eventually, after weeks of drifting on these unpredictable frozen rafts, the ice began to thin, and that was both a problem and a solution. They couldn't stay on the floes much longer. The danger of sudden breakage and drowning was increasing by the hour. The men were soaked, half-starved, frost-bitten, and losing patience with every icy sunrise. Shackleton decided it was time to make a move. The boats salvaged from the Endurance, previously hauled across the floes like sacred relics, were now their best shot at salvation. They would head for open water. Their destination? Elephant Island, a jagged, inhospitable spit of rock that in any other circumstance would have looked like purgatory. But to Shackleton's men it shimmered like Valhalla. Camp misery was packed up one final time. Tents rolled, rations inventoried, goodbyes whispered to the floe that somehow hadn't murdered them. They climbed into the boats, still unsure if the journey ahead was the escape or the end credits. But one thing was certain. If Antarctica had been trying to kill them, it had picked the wrong group of lunatics. At this point in the Shackleton saga, things had gone from bad to I think Antarctica is actively trying to murder us. The Endurance had sunk, the dogs were gone, the ice floes had floated everyone into nowhere, and food supplies were now 1 part penguin, 2 parts prayer. The crew had been stranded in the frozen jaws of the Weddell Sea for over a year, and Shackleton realized something that no explorer wants to admit. No one was coming to save them. So naturally, his next move was to grab a lifeboat and row across the worst ocean on Earth. Let's be clear, this was not a sleek yacht or some handy survival raft with Wi-Fi and snacks. This was the James Caird, a 22.5-foot wooden lifeboat, originally designed for emergency paddling, not 800 miles of high seas heroism. If boats had emotions, the James Caird would have already written its will. Shackleton selected 5 men to go with him, which really speaks to his talent for motivational speeches, because the correct response to "Who wants to sail into a hurricane on a glorified canoe?" is hard pass. But these men weren't just crew, they were loyal, possibly frostbitten, and just bored enough to try it. The mission: sail from Elephant Island to South Georgia, a remote whaling station where help might exist, and where, presumably, everyone wasn't already dead. The problem between them and salvation was the Drake Passage, arguably the most psychotic body of water on the planet. It's where oceans go to throw tantrums, and they were going to row straight through it. They launched on April 24, 1916, into the kind of ocean that even sharks avoid. From day one, the elements were less bad weather and more full-scale aquatic vendetta. Wind howled, waves towered, ice froze over every surface, including their clothes, their boots, and occasionally their facial expressions. It rained, it snowed. At one point it hailed sideways, and somehow, miraculously, the boat stayed afloat. Did I mention the James Caird had no cabin? Sleeping was done under a canvas tarp, which flapped like a haunted tent and leaked like a broken promise. Their navigational tools were gloriously unhelpful. A pocket compass, some sea charts, a sextant, and Frank Worsley's best guess. Worsley, Endurance's captain and resident miracle worker, managed to chart their position by taking celestial readings during brief seconds when the clouds stopped screaming. And the food? Let's just say it made the penguin dinners look like Michelin-starred cuisine. They had some biscuits, some powdered milk, a bit of jam, and 1 tin of beef, which they wisely rationed to avoid turning the voyage into Lord of the Flies Antarctic edition. Their primary water source was melted ice, often mixed with salt spray and boat grit. It was like drinking sadness. But here's where it gets truly absurd. Despite the vomiting seas, the freezing spray, the questionable food, and the fact that their sleeping bags were usually frozen solid, the 6 men aboard the James Caird managed to survive 17 days at sea. That's 17, with no dry socks, no real shelter, and no guarantee that the island they were heading toward even had any whalers left. Honestly, by day 5, most people would have invented a religion just to pray for a giant seagull to carry them home. Then came the hurricane. Yes, an actual hurricane. Nature, never one to skip an opportunity to spice things up, flung a full-force storm at their tiny boat. Waves up to 60 feet crashed down around them. One of Shackleton's men later described it as surfing on a coffin. They had to bail water by hand, patch sails in gale-force winds, and take turns steering while their skin froze to the tiller. At one point, They spotted a ship being sunk by the storm in the distance. Casual reminder, Shackleton's crew was doing this in a rowboat that barely deserved the title seaworthy, but somehow they made it. On May 10, 1916, the James Caird, barely intact and full of half-dead explorers, crashed onto the shores of South Georgia Island. The men were so weak that they couldn't even stand properly. Their hair was matted in ice, their eyes were sunken, they looked like shipwrecked crypt keepers, but they were alive. Shackleton had done the impossible, again. Well, almost, because the whaling station, it was on the other side of the island, and no one had ever crossed that part before. But that's a disaster for the next chapter. So to recap, 1 tiny boat, 1 suicidal route, 6 men, 0 hope, and 800 miles of the angriest ocean in the known universe. Shackleton didn't just gamble with death, he bluffed, raised the stakes and rode straight through hell with a half-frozen poker face. And somehow he wasn't done yet. After surviving a casual 800-mile splash through hurricane-infested seas in a glorified rowboat, you'd think Shackleton might allow himself a nap, or perhaps a celebratory penguin steak. But no, our hero and his 2 equally mad companions, Frank Worsley and Tom Crean, instead stared at the jagged, snow-smothered mountains of South Georgia Island and collectively said, "Yeah, let's walk across those." There was just one problem. Well, several actually. The mountains were uncharted, as in, literally no maps. The central spine of South Georgia had never been crossed by humans before, mostly because anyone with an ounce of self-preservation had looked at those peaks and said, "Hard pass." There were glaciers, cliffs, crevasses, avalanches, and enough snow to make a snowman union go on strike. But the trio had no choice. They had landed on the wrong side of the island. The whaling station they needed was 36 hours away, if you happened to be a bird, or a teleporting Norwegian. They had 0 climbing gear, no crampons, no ropes, no ice axes, not even a pair of gloves that weren't pretending to be mittens out of sheer frostbite. Their boots were worn to the sole, their clothing was soaked, and their mountaineering training, let's just say it consisted of not dying on mountains. So far. But Shackleton had a talent for motivational lying. To his men he made it sound like they were taking a light stroll through a snowy park. In reality, it was like trying to hike the Alps while sleep-deprived, hallucinating, and wrapped in wet dish towels. Still, they pressed on. The trio began climbing at 2 a.m. because apparently sleep is for people not trapped in a life-or-death Arctic drama. The stars offered some light, and the terrain offered mostly vertical ice walls. Worsley, who doubled as their navigator, had only a watch and a pocket compass to guide them. No sextant, no GPS, no idea, just sheer gut instinct. And the occasional prayer whispered into the wind. They climbed, slid, and stumbled across mountain passes, sometimes roping themselves together with whatever they could find. At one point, they reached the edge of a ridge and peered down into a deep, dark void of fog. Unable to tell what was below, they literally slid down the slope on their backsides like 3 Victorian children on a snow day, only with higher stakes and lower survival odds. And yet there was a strange rhythm to their madness. They marched without stopping, fueled by frozen rations, lukewarm tea, and sheer Shackletonian stubbornness. At times the cold clawed into their bones so deeply they could barely speak. Worsley later described hearing what he thought were church bells, hallucinations from fatigue and desperation. But then came the most mysterious moment of the entire ordeal, the 4th man. All 3 climbers later admitted they felt the presence of an invisible companion guiding them, something they couldn't see but could feel. Shackleton would later write, "It seemed to me often that we were 4, not 3. This odd detail spurred decades of spiritual speculation, ghost theories, and literary metaphors. Maybe it was divine intervention, maybe it was hypothermia-induced delusion, or maybe South Georgia had really good Wi-Fi for ghosts. After 36 hours of non-stop trudging, yes, 36 hours without sleep, shelter, or even a decent granola bar, they finally descended through a waterfall, yes, a literal waterfall, and stumbled into Stromness, the whaling station they had set out to find. Shackleton, soaked, ragged and bearded like a wizard who lost his staff, asked the startled manager for help. The Norwegians, who hadn't seen the expedition in over a year, were speechless. It was as if a bunch of shipwrecked pirates had just waltzed into town asking for tea. Back on the beach, Shackleton's remaining crew on the James Caird had no idea if he was alive or frostbitten mulch. But against all odds, the climb had worked. Not only had they crossed a mountain range no one else ever had, but they'd also done it while breaking every possible rule of mountaineering. They didn't just survive, they made history. But this wasn't the end. The real challenge would now be going back across those nightmare seas to rescue the men still stranded on Elephant Island. Because Shackleton, in true form, didn't consider himself a success until everyone came home alive. Still, for one frigid, miraculous trek over the uncharted mountains of South Georgia, 3 exhausted explorers rewrote what human beings were capable of. No gear, no maps, just determination, instinct, and the collective agreement not to keel over until the mission was done. It wasn't a climb, it was a statement. And that statement was, we have absolutely no idea what we're doing, but we're doing it anyway. Next stop, the final rescue. But first, maybe a sandwich and a nap. By August 1916, Sir Ernest Shackleton was looking considerably worse for wear, half-starved, bearded like a mythological hermit, and powered solely by tea, desperation, and a refusal to die just yet. After sailing across a death trap of an ocean and mountaineering with all the grace of frost-bitten walruses, Shackleton finally stumbled into the whaling station at Stromness on the civilized side of South Georgia. He hadn't bathed in weeks, hadn't slept properly in months, and looked like he'd been exiled from the underworld. The first man he encountered reportedly turned pale and said, "Who the hell are you?" The answer was simple. A man on a mission to save 22 souls still camped back on the edge of nowhere. The moment was surreal. Shackleton had made it, against all logic, physics and common sense. He had reached the island's populated side, and now he could do what he'd set out to do, rescue his stranded crew. He wasted no time. Within hours, the local whalers were helping him send a message to the outside world. The Endurance expedition was still alive, somehow, miraculously, ridiculously. But getting to help wasn't the same as getting help. The world, as Shackleton quickly found out, had gotten even worse in his absence. World War I was still in full swing, and finding a ship that wasn't busy dodging torpedoes or ferrying soldiers was about as easy as finding sunscreen in Antarctica. Shackleton tried again and again, begging, borrowing, and sweet-talking his way into any kind of vessel that could make the perilous return journey to Elephant Island. His first 3 attempts were total busts. Either the ships couldn't break through the ice, or they nearly got stuck themselves. It was a bureaucratic, nautical, and emotional nightmare. But Shackleton was stubborn, like row across the Southern Ocean in a glorified dinghy stubborn. On his 4th attempt, aboard a borrowed Chilean steamer named the Yelcho, he finally made it. It was late August, over 4 months since he had left the stranded men behind. When the Yelcho steamed into sight, the crew of Elephant Island could barely believe it. According to reports, they ran out of their makeshift hut, shouting and waving like children seeing their dad at the school play. Frank Wilde, who had been left in charge, reportedly told the men to pack up like the boss might arrive today. Then Shackleton did exactly that. The head count was the same as when he left. 22 ragged, bearded, frost-nipped souls. Every single man alive. Let's pause for a second, because in terms of odds, this was less likely than surviving a cannonball duel with a grizzly bear on a unicycle. Shackleton had led 27 men into the harshest environment on Earth, lost his ship, camped on drifting ice, sailed into hurricane conditions, mountaineered without a map, and still returned with not a single death on his record. It's the kind of outcome that makes you wonder if the Grim Reaper took one look and said, "Nope, not today." That's not to say the crew was fine. No one goes through that ordeal and skips off into retirement. Most of them dealt with trauma, lingering health issues, and the unfortunate realization that no one in civilization would fully understand what they had been through. Their stories would be overshadowed by the war raging back home. And yet, to a man, they credited their survival to Shackleton's leadership. His relentless optimism, his instinct for morale, and occasionally his unblinking insistence that cannibalism was off the table. What makes Shackleton's story legendary isn't just that he survived, it's that he dragged survival out of the jaws of utter collapse and convinced 26 other men to follow him through it, frostbite and all. He failed his mission spectacularly. There was no crossing of the continent, no major scientific breakthrough, but he succeeded in something far more difficult, returning from a place where hope freezes solid. In the end, Shackleton became a symbol not of conquest, but of resilience, of leadership that doesn't rely on glory, medals, or triumph, but on refusing to quit when all logical people would have taken a nice nap on the ice and let fate do its thing. The final tally of his expedition: 0 Antarctic traversals, 0 lives lost, and an infinite supply of courage that still echoes through polar history. If leadership were a sport, Shackleton would be playing it barefoot on broken glass in a blizzard, and still winning, because in the words of every man who followed him into the cold, he never gave up, so neither did we. Let's get this out of the way. Sir Ernest Shackleton failed, spectacularly. He didn't cross Antarctica. He didn't even touch the continent's interior. He didn't bring back treasures, claim new land, or plant flags on icy peaks. And yet, somehow, he's one of the most celebrated explorers in history. Why? Because he brought every single one of his crew home alive after a journey so brutal it makes the Revenant look like a spa weekend. And in a world where polar explorers were dropping like frostbitten dominoes, that counted for a lot. Let's compare. Robert Falcon Scott, famous for his 1912 South Pole expedition, reached his destination, which is a gold star for effort. But by the time he got there, Roald Amundsen had already beaten him by 5 weeks and eaten all the celebratory sled dogs. Worse still, Scott and his entire team died on the way back, slowly freezing and starving in a tent. Then there's Fridtjof Nansen, who floated around the Arctic in a wooden boat full of seal meat and raw optimism. He survived, yes, but mostly by ice hopping for months and eating polar bear sandwiches. Shackleton, by contrast, lost his ship, drifted on ice floes, rode through hurricanes, scaled mountains in worn-out boots, and did not lose a single man. No one froze to death. No one was eaten, not even the guy who kept playing banjo during dinner. In the world of doomed expeditions, Shackleton became the patron saint of almost dying but not quite. Today, Shackleton's name is plastered across motivational posters, corporate seminars, and that one HR training course where you're not sure if you're being inspired or gaslit. Why? Because his leadership under pressure was nothing short of sorcery. He wasn't just guiding men through snow, he was guiding their minds through despair. When morale dropped, he played the cheerful optimist. When someone threatened discipline, he cracked down like a Victorian dad with a belt made of frozen resolve. And when it got really bad, like we have to eat our sled dogs bad, he shared every burden. Literally, same rations, same tent, same snow in the boots. And unlike some leaders, he didn't make empty promises. He said it would be hard. It was. He said they might not make it. They nearly didn't. But every choice he made prioritized one thing: his men's survival. Shackleton returned to Britain a hero, but not a rich one. His story didn't end in parades or knighthoods with diamond scepters. It ended with lectures, fundraising dinners, and another doomed expedition attempt in 1921, where he died of a heart attack before even reaching Antarctica. He never found glory in the traditional sense, but his real treasure was the admiration of his men, and eventually the world. They didn't just respect him, they worshipped him. They'd watched him hold their tiny frozen world together with duct tape, dog meat, and sheer force of personality. Even today, military academies and business schools teach the Shackleton way as a blueprint for leading when everything is on fire and frozen. Make no mistake, you wouldn't want to travel with Shackleton. This was a man who looked at a map of uncharted ice hell and said, "Yes, let's bring 27 men, 5 tons of meat, and a cat." He was relentless, stubborn, and very possibly allergic to comfort. His expeditions involved zero sunshine, negative fun, and a daily chance of freezing your tongue to your boot. But would you want him in charge when everything falls apart? Absolutely. Because while other leaders planned for success, Shackleton planned for failure and still found a way through it. That's not just exploration, that's legendary crisis management wearing a frozen beard and borrowed socks. Shackleton didn't conquer Antarctica, but he conquered something far harder, the human tendency to fall apart when hope dies. In a place where compasses lied, ships crumbled, and even the sun seemed to give up, he held the line. His men didn't come back as heroes of empire. They came back alive, and that somehow was more impressive. And that's why today, over a century later, we don't remember him as the man who failed to cross the continent. We remember him as the man who refused to let it unalive him or anyone else. Before Charles Darwin doodled finches, there was a little girl on the storm-battered coast of southern England, selling shells, dodging rocks, and unknowingly rewriting scientific history. Welcome to Lyme Regis, a charming seaside town that sounds like it should be full of quaint tea houses but was, in Mary Anning's time, basically a damp, eroding cliff with a market. Mary was born there in 1799, the fifth of 10 children, though only 2 survived to adulthood. In other words, life hit the ground running and then promptly slid down a muddy hill. Her father, Richard Anning, was a cabinet maker by trade, which unfortunately doesn't pay well when your cabinet customers are just as broke as you are. So to make ends meet, Richard would also comb the nearby cliffs with Mary and her brother Joseph, hunting for what locals called curiosities, odd little fossilized shells, ammonites and bones embedded in limestone, which they'd polish and sell to tourists as natural souvenirs. And yes, this is where the tongue twister comes in. Mary Anning quite literally sold seashells by the seashore, long before that rhyme became a verbal trap for Victorian children and modern drunk uncles. Now, picture this. You're a toddler walking across a jagged, crumbling English cliffside in gale-force winds, trying to spot ancient bones while your teeth chatter in Victorian poverty. That was Mary's early training. While other girls were learning embroidery, Mary was learning stratigraphy. At age 5, she was already out collecting adults. But tragedy struck early and often. When Mary was just 11, her father slipped on the cliffs and died from his injuries, leaving the family in crippling debt. No pensions, no insurance, no backup plan, just a widow with kids and a rapidly decaying cottage. The Annings were now officially broke, even by 19th century standards, so Mary and Joseph doubled down on fossil hunting. Not because it was fun, though Mary genuinely loved it, but because it was survival. Selling ammonites and belemnites, ancient squid-like creatures turned into spiraled stone, became their primary income. Tourists who came to Lyme Regis for the sea air were often more than happy to take home a mysterious fossil as a keepsake. Bonus points if they could pretend it was magical or cursed. Mary, still a teenager, began to gain a reputation as a sharp-eyed fossil finder. Her knowledge was entirely self-taught, mostly gathered from books she borrowed, begged for, or couldn't afford. She read texts on geology, biology, and ancient history, absorbing it all with the ferocity of someone who didn't have the luxury of formal education. Remember, women weren't allowed in universities, scientific societies, or lectures, but Mary Anning had cliffs and curiosity, and that turned out to be a pretty powerful combination. Still, the world around her didn't offer much in return. Imagine being a scientific genius, but the only recognition you get is from rich tourists, haggling you down on the price of an ammonite. That was her reality. She sold to collectors, gentlemen scholars, and museums, many of whom happily accepted the fossil, but forgot to mention Mary's name when they published papers about it later, because naturally, when a young woman without credentials finds something groundbreaking, the correct response is, let's pretend Lord Trousers von Wigpowder discovered this instead. But back to young Mary. By the time she was in her teens, she wasn't just collecting shells anymore. She was pulling vertebrae, jawbones, and skull fragments out of cliff walls like some kind of seaside necromancer. She could spot a bone fragment buried in shale from 30 feet away and tell you whether it belonged to a fish, a lizard, or something no one had ever even seen before. It was more than talent, it was obsession, honed by necessity. And she didn't just find fossils. She cleaned them, documented them, and reassembled them like prehistoric jigsaw puzzles. With a little help from Joseph, she would cart her findings back to town, sometimes lugging enormous skulls in a wheelbarrow, just to prep them for sale. This chapter of her life was quiet, unglamorous, and deeply rooted in struggle. But without this phase, without the years of trudging up slippery cliffs, selling ammonites to tourists, and reading science books under candlelight, the rest of her story wouldn't exist. So yes, she sold seashells by the seashore. But unlike the nursery rhyme, Mary's story wasn't nonsense. It was the origin of paleontology as we know it. If modern paleontologists complain about sunburns and sore backs, they've clearly never worked the Jurassic coast in the early 1800s with nothing but a pickaxe, a basket, and the looming threat of being buried alive. For Mary Anning, fossil hunting wasn't a charming seaside hobby. It was an extreme sport with a fatality rate. Imagine cliff diving, boulder dodging, and amateur spelunking all rolled into one, except you do it for pennies, without safety gear, and in a corset. Lyme Regis, where Mary lived, is known today for its scenic beauty, charming fossil shops, and gently overpriced scones. But in Mary's day, it was a geological death trap. The region sat right on top of one of Earth's richest fossil beds, a treasure trove of prehistoric bones tucked inside crumbling cliffs that had all the structural integrity of a wet biscuit. These cliffs were made of blue liars, a sedimentary rock that's great for preserving ancient sea monsters, but even better at collapsing unexpectedly when a strong breeze rolls through. Now, Mary wasn't just walking along the beach waiting for a fossil to tap her on the shoulder. She was scaling cliffs with ropes, chiseling through solid rock, and sometimes lying on her stomach over ledges to reach exposed bones dangling above the crashing sea. Add to that a constant drizzle, slippery moss, and the ever-present British weather, and you've got yourself a daily game of Will Mary Survive Today? She often worked alone or with her brother Joseph, because apparently the best way to bond as siblings is while dodging landslides. In fact, one of her earliest finds, the now famous Ichthyosaurus, was spotted shortly after a rockfall revealed part of its skeleton. That same kind of rockfall could have flattened her like a prehistoric pancake. She was in her early teens when that happened. While other teenagers were sneaking off to flirt behind haystacks, Mary was extracting sea dragons from geological time bombs. And let's not forget the tides. Oh, the charming, soul-stealing tides. Lyme Regis has some of the highest tidal ranges in Britain. A fossil hunter could be blissfully chipping away at a promising ribcage, only to look up and find their return path swallowed by the sea. Mary had more than a few close calls with waves lapping at her boots, and one terrifying moment where she was nearly swept away entirely. Her dog, Trey, wasn't so lucky. He was killed in a landslide while faithfully watching over her. Pour one out for Trey, the first canine paleontology assistant, and possibly the last. Fossil hunting for Mary wasn't just about curiosity, it was survival. After her father died, she became the breadwinner, literally digging for dinner money. But survival came with risk. One slip, one crumble of earth, one poorly timed gust of wind, and she could have been buried in the same sediment that preserved her beloved ammonites. The irony would have been unbearable, and yet she went out day after day. She didn't have formal education, a wealthy patron, or even decent boots, but she had an iron will, a sharp eye, and the ability to tell a chunk of rock from the tip of a plesiosaur's jaw. While most people would have taken one look at those cliffs and said, "Absolutely not," Mary said. That boulder looks promising." Perhaps the most miraculous part of her fossil hunting escapades wasn't what she found. It's that she lived long enough to find anything at all. Climbing gear didn't exist. Helmets were for soldiers, not seaside teenagers. And there were no scientific grants or government safety regulations. Just a girl, a cliff, and the hope that the rocks wouldn't rearrange themselves while she was standing under them. In truth, Mary Anning was part scientist, part stuntwoman, and part gambler. Each fossil dig was a roll of the dice. jackpot, or jaw injury. Her daily routine involved more physical peril than most action movie heroes endure in an entire franchise, but she kept going, bruised, drenched, exhausted, because she loved it, and maybe, just maybe, because she knew she was uncovering something no one else had. So the next time someone calls paleontology boring, tell them about Mary Anning, who quite literally stared death in the face to pry ancient monsters from the earth, not for fame, not for glory, but for science, survival, and maybe a few shillings to buy bread, because while her fossils were from the Jurassic period, her work ethic was 100% rock solid. In the great tale of paleontology, there's a recurring theme, a brilliant discovery, followed swiftly by a scholarly man in a powdered wig taking credit. This chapter's shining moment of fossil glory belongs to Mary Anning, aged 12, muddy, cold, and armed with nothing but curiosity and a pocketful of determination. Her prize? The first nearly complete Ichthyosaur skeleton the world had ever seen, and the prize for writing the paper on it? That went to someone else entirely. Let's rewind. It was 1811. Mary Anning was barely out of childhood, growing up in Lyme Regis, a sleepy seaside town on England's Jurassic coast. This wasn't a quaint, beachy escape full of sun hats and fish and chips. No, this was a place where the cliffs were made of muddy limestone stacked with secrets from a prehistoric world. And those cliffs? Crumbly, dangerous, and one wrong step away from turning you into the next fossil. Mary and her older brother Joseph were already well acquainted with fossil hunting by then. It was how they put food on the table. Joseph once found a strange skull embedded in the rock, long, crocodilian, and unlike anything he or Mary had seen. But it was Mary who took it a step further. For months she clawed, scraped, and braved rain, landslides, and a complete lack of safety protocols to uncover the full skeleton, a lizard with paddles for limbs, teeth like daggers, and the body of a torpedo. She had found something extraordinary, an ichthyosaur, which, by the way, translates loosely to fish lizard, a name that sounds like a joke you'd make when your Pokemon evolution gets stuck midway. But back then the term dinosaur hadn't even been invented. The idea that the Earth had once been ruled by enormous reptiles, that was still borderline heretical. Many folks genuinely thought she had dug up the remains of some biblical sea dragon, because of course she had. Now here's where it gets annoying. Mary's fossil was bought by a local collector who promptly donated it to the London Museum of Natural History, where it became an instant sensation. Suddenly, the Royal Society and naturalists across England were abuzz, not about Mary, of course, but about the specimen. Learned gentlemen penned long Latin-drenched articles about the ichthyosaur, its anatomy, its place in natural history, how it challenged theological timelines, and who signed their names to these academic breakthroughs. Spoiler, not the teenage girl who risked her life to find it. In fact, her name was rarely even mentioned. At best, she was referred to obliquely, like a specimen discovered by a local collector, as if she had merely tripped over it while building a sandcastle. The real credit went to people like Sir Everard Home and other scientific gentlemen, who were very good at writing about fossils but noticeably absent when it came to clambering down a rain-slicked cliff to yank one out. Imagine you find an ancient sea creature the size of a grand piano, and instead of a round of applause, a man named Reginald publishes a paper about it and gets invited to dinner with the Royal Society. But Mary, for her part, kept digging. Literally and figuratively, she kept finding more. Fossils, yes, but also validation in a way. The ichthyosaur had put her on the map, even if the map still labelled her as that fossil girl from Lyme. She didn't stop to complain. She didn't storm off in protest. She just went back to the cliffs with her dog Trey by her side and her eyes scanning the rocks for the next prehistoric secret. Because here's the thing about Mary Anning. She wasn't doing this for fame. She wasn't chasing headlines or scientific papers. She just knew she was right, that these strange bones in the cliff mattered, that they told stories older than anyone could imagine, that they were the key to understanding a world no one had dared to believe existed. Her discovery of the ichthyosaur did more than shake up geology. It cracked open the doors to deep time. Suddenly, People had to confront the idea that Earth had a past that wasn't 6,000 years old and didn't involve just two people and a particularly disobedient snake. And while the scholarly men were slow to admit it, Mary's find was the catalyst. So yes, a young girl found a 200-million-year-old sea monster, and grown men found a way to get tenure from it. But history, with its long memory and stubborn sense of justice, is finally starting to put the spotlight where it belongs. Today, we don't remember the man who wrote the first paper on ichthyosaurs. We remember the girl with a hammer and a stubborn streak who went out after a storm and brought back a piece of prehistory. Mary Anning, fossil hunter, uncredited genius, and the original reason we all know what an ichthyosaur even is. In the 19th century, if you were a woman with a brilliant mind, an unmatched fossil collection, and a deep understanding of prehistoric life, you could expect the full support of the scientific community, so long as you were fictional. Mary Anning was all too real, and the scientific establishment of her day didn't quite know what to do with that. They admired her work, used her discoveries, and built reputations off her fossils, but when it came time for recognition, sorry Mary, ladies must exit stage left, preferably without speaking. To understand just how hard the odds were stacked against her, you need to know that Mary lived in a time when women couldn't vote, own property in many cases, or attend university. That last one, pretty important if you're trying to become a respected scientist. While male geologists strolled into Royal Society meetings and puffed on cigars while debating the origins of ammonites, Mary was stuck outside, quite literally, with a basket of fossils and no formal title. She couldn't join the Geological Society of London because women weren't admitted until 1904, 57 years after her death. She couldn't publish scientific papers because journals didn't take articles from women seriously, if at all. The unspoken rule was simple. If you were a woman, your place in science was as a curious anomaly or an assistant, not as the discoverer or author. But Mary Anning didn't need permission to be brilliant. She dissected ancient marine reptiles with precision. She understood geological strata better than most men with degrees. Her fossil shop in Lyme Regis became a must-visit stop for elite scientists, the ones who could join societies, write papers and collect awards by building on her findings. To give credit where credit is ironically due, many of these men did admire Mary. They just had no idea how to reconcile that admiration with the rigid social structure of their time. Instead of formally including her in their papers or society minutes, they'd mention her in passing. Specimen obtained from Miss Anning, or worse, not at all. It's like thanking the waiter for dinner but not the chef who cooked it. And then there were the letters. Oh, the letters. Mary corresponded with many prominent geologists, writing about her discoveries, sharing theories, and asking brilliant questions. Often these letters would end up in academic archives, unattributed in publications but deeply influential. Her sharp observations about fossil anatomy guided more than one major paper, none of which had her name on the byline. She wasn't silent about it either. In one pointed letter she described how it felt to see others take credit. The world has used me so unkindly, I fear it has made me suspicious of everyone. That wasn't bitterness. That was a clear-eyed recognition of a system built to applaud her work while erasing her name. Still, Mary kept going. She didn't chase accolades, probably because she knew they'd never be offered. Instead, she kept doing the work, digging, studying, collecting. She taught herself anatomy, learned Latin to understand scientific texts, and became a self-made expert while society tried very hard not to look directly at her. Every fossil she sold, and every sketch she shared with a London scientist, was another quiet rebellion. She may not have been able to walk through the front doors of the Geological Society, but her fossils sat in their collections, her discoveries filled their cabinets, and her insights shaped their debates. She wasn't in the room, but she might as well have built the walls. In the few cases where she was acknowledged, it came begrudgingly and always with a faint whiff of surprise, as though it was somehow shocking that a woman without formal education could know what she was talking about. Scientists like Henry Delabèche and William Buckland sometimes praised her, but more often in private than in public. And even then their praise came with caveats. as if her gender needed to be footnoted along with her intelligence. Today, of course, we look back and gasp at the injustice. But for Mary, it was just the way things were. A daily grind of brilliance met with dismissal. She wasn't asking for a statue, though she deserved several. She just wanted the truth of her discoveries to be known, and maybe, once in a while, for her name to be printed in the right place at the top. Mary Anning didn't just fight for fossils, she fought to exist in a world that refused to let her, and somehow she did, quietly, fiercely, without an official degree, but with all the credentials that mattered: sharp eyes, steady hands, and a mind that saw ancient oceans where others just saw rocks. Before dinosaurs had names that could headline blockbuster movies, they were simply known as curious beasts, large reptilian oddities, or, for the more scientific among us, what on earth is that? In the early 1800s, paleontology wasn't really a science yet. It was more like a very dirty hobby for gentlemen with a lot of spare time and a peculiar interest in bones. It's into this gloriously awkward phase of science that Mary Anning marched, covered in chalk dust and far ahead of her time. Mary didn't know she was founding a scientific revolution. She just wanted to make rent. By the time Mary was unearthing fossils from the crumbling cliffs of Lyme Regis, nobody had said the word dinosaur, mainly because the word didn't exist yet. That wouldn't happen until 1842, when British anatomist Richard Owen coined dinosauria, meaning terrible lizard, which honestly sounds like a schoolyard insult more than a scientific term. But decades before that name hit the academic papers, Mary Anning was pulling skeletons from ancient seabeds and carting them into town like it was just another Tuesday. She wasn't just finding loose bones. Mary found full prehistoric skeletons of creatures no one had ever seen before. Most famously, of course, her Ichthyosaur discovery made waves. But that wasn't the end. Mary also discovered plesiosaurs, pterosaurs, and enough fossilized fish to open a museum/sushi bar. Her finds were so strange and alien that people didn't know whether to put them in the natural history section or start praying harder. One of the biggest hurdles was that scientists didn't have a clue what these creatures were. A fossil of a four-flippered marine reptile with a neck like a snake and a body like a bloated turtle? That was weird. But was it a fish? A reptile? A very angry eel? No one knew. The scientific community wobbled between fascination and confusion, like toddlers with a Rubik's Cube. Even Owen, who would later become known as the father of dinosaurs, spent part of his career trying to figure out if Mary's plesiosaur was real or just a clever hoax. To their credit, these fossils did look like something a Victorian prankster might glue together for a laugh. Before paleontology was a proper science, it was still stuck somewhere between mythology and natural curiosity. Ancient thinkers believed fossils were either the bones of giants, leftovers from the Great Flood, or God's attempt at abstract sculpture. So Mary's contributions didn't just add to science, they pushed it to evolve. Her finds forced men in powdered wigs to sit down, clutch their brandy glasses and say, "Well, I suppose nature has been at work longer than we thought." Mary's fossils provided the physical evidence that supported groundbreaking new theories like extinction. Up until then, many believed God would never let one of his creations die off, as though Earth was an eternal zoo with free refills. But staring at the massive skull of a creature that looked nothing like anything alive, even the most pious scholars began to wonder if, just maybe, things had changed a bit since Genesis. But while men were busy building theories, Mary was still out in the rain digging them up. Her influence on early paleontology was colossal, even if it was often uncredited. She provided specimens, detailed observations, and invaluable insights to leading scientists of her time. When she couldn't access academic journals because, women, she simply figured things out for herself. She noticed the curvature of vertebrae, she reconstructed skeletons like a prehistoric puzzle master, and she pointed out when the gentleman had misassembled a skull backwards. Spoiler. They had. Still, recognition was as fossilized as the bones she dug up. Mary helped shape a science before the science knew it needed shaping. She found creatures before anyone knew what to call them. She built the foundations of paleontology, one treacherous cliffside dig at a time. And she did it all in an era when women were encouraged to collect teacups, not fossils. Let's be honest. The fact that she discovered dinosaurs before dinosaur was a word is both inspiring and absolutely maddening. Mary was ahead of the curve, and unfortunately the curve didn't catch up until long after she'd passed. While Victorian scientists fiddled with Latin names and tried to decide whether her plesiosaur was scientifically viable or just Victorian horror art, Mary had already moved on, probably prying the next ancient beast out of a rock. So the next time you hear a child shout T-Rex, or a paleontologist rattle off some multisyllabic beast name like Brachiosaurus altithorax, remember that the woman who made it all possible didn't wait for the vocabulary to show up. She just kept digging. In 1823, Mary Anning pulled off the fossil equivalent of finding a unicorn skeleton, and naturally, Victorian science had an existential meltdown. By this point, Mary had already shocked the scientific world by unearthing an ichthyosaur as a literal child. But her latest find? A creature so strange it made the ichthyosaur look like yesterday's news. It was long-necked, it had a tiny head, it had flippers, not legs, and it looked like something that should either be swimming in your nightmares or guest starring in an H.P. Lovecraft short story. This was the Plesiosaurus, and no one had ever seen anything like it, mainly because it had been extinct for about 200 million years, but also because it looked like someone had glued a snake to a turtle and called it a day. Mary found the fossil embedded in the cliffs of Lyme Regis, because where else? Carefully excavated it piece by piece, skull, vertebrae, ribcage, flippers and all, and assembled it into one gloriously confusing prehistoric beast. She knew it was important, she knew it was unique, and she knew it was going to cause a stir. But what she didn't know is that the stir would come with a side of fossil fraud accusations and a dollop of patronizing disbelief. Enter Georges Cuvier, a French anatomist, famous for being brilliant and even more famous for being, well, French about it. Cuvier was no slouch. He practically invented comparative anatomy. But when word of the plesiosaur reached his perfectly powdered ears, he did not respond with awe or excitement. No, Cuvier's response was essentially, "This woman clearly glued the head on backwards." In his defense, though only slightly, the plesiosaur did look suspicious. Its head was unusually small compared to its elongated serpentine neck. Its limbs were flat and wide, more like paddles than legs. Victorian science wasn't prepared for a creature that looked like it had been designed by committee, and a drunk one at that. Cuvier declared the fossil a hoax, too many vertebrae, skull too small. Clearly someone, a woman, had combined bits from different animals and passed it off as a single creature, a prehistoric Frankenbeast. And because Mary Anning was a poor, self-taught fossil collector with no formal scientific standing and, crucially, no Y chromosome, her credibility was instantly called into question. But here's where it gets deliciously awkward for the skeptics. Other scientists, actual men in cravats and wigs, came to Lyme Regis. They looked at the fossil. They compared it to existing specimens. And one by one they began to realize something unsettling. Mary was right. Not just technically correct, the best kind of correct, but groundbreaking, paradigm-shifting, shove your prejudices back in your pocket correct. The plesiosaur was real, the fossil was genuine. The anatomy, bizarre as it was, matched what would later be found in similar finds across Europe. Cuvier, to his credit, kind of admitted his mistake. In the 19th century male scientist equivalent of apologizing, he wrote a letter that roughly translated to, I suppose the tiny-headed sea serpent is plausible. My bad. Mary, for her part, didn't gloat. She didn't write long rebuttals in the Times. She didn't even sarcastically sign her name, Mary definitely not a fossil fraud Anning. No, she just kept working, kept digging, kept doing the job better than anyone else in Britain, and yet she still didn't get invited to the Geological Society. She still couldn't publish under her own name. Her contribution to science remained a whispered footnote, while men gave lectures about her fossils with the confidence of people who hadn't nearly been crushed by a rock slide to find them. But the plesiosaur? That cemented her legacy, because it was so weird, so unique, and so undeniably correct that even the skeptics couldn't ignore it. She'd discovered something that rewrote what scientists thought they knew about prehistoric life. Imagine being so good at your job that the only explanation people can come up with is witchcraft. Mary wasn't just digging up bones. She was dragging the scientific establishment, kicking and screaming, into the Mesozoic. Today, the plesiosaur is one of the crown jewels of early paleontology. Its image adorns textbooks, museum walls, and the occasional blurry photo claiming to show the Loch Ness monster. And Mary Anning's discovery still stands as a turning point, the moment when fossil collecting evolved into serious science, all thanks to a woman who refused to back down, even when the men insisted the head was on the wrong end. Mary Anning's correspondence should be legendary. Sadly, it's more of a cautionary tale in academic theft. While her fossil finds shook the very foundations of natural history, her name was often buried deeper than the bones she unearthed. And why? Because 19th century science had a habit of pretending their best ideas sprouted exclusively from men in waistcoats with Latin degrees and large sideburns. By the time Mary was in her 20s, she wasn't just an amateur collector with a knack for unearthing marine reptiles. She had become, effectively, an unpaid consultant to Britain's finest gentlemen of science. They would come to Lyme Regis, nervously peer over cliffs in clean shoes, and then find Mary, sunburnt, dusty, possibly holding the skull of an ancient monster in one hand and a lunch sandwich in the other. They would ask questions. She would provide answers. They would write letters asking for clarification. She would reply. Then they would publish, without her name, standard gentlemanly conduct. And let's be clear, Mary wasn't just providing casual trivia. She was identifying anatomical features, suggesting evolutionary relationships, and interpreting the sedimentary layers like a prehistoric psychic. When fossilized poop, coprolite to be polite, started turning up, it was Mary who realized these weren't just rocks with a bad attitude. They were the petrified leftovers of creatures that had once munched, digested, and you know the rest. One man in particular, the geologist William Buckland, became famous for his analysis of coprolites. Guess who supplied most of them? That's right, the woman who couldn't get a seat at the scientific table but could apparently get a stool sample from the Jurassic. She corresponded with influential scientists like Henry Delabèche and Richard Owen, both of whom received generous praise, academic accolades, and in Owen's case, a long legacy in museums and textbooks. Mary? She got a thank you note. Maybe, possibly accompanied by a politely worded suggestion that she might enjoy sending more fossils next time. Even worse, her letters were often signed off with subtle humility, likely a product of both her working-class upbringing and her knowledge that women speaking too confidently in male-dominated fields often found themselves laughed out of the room, or worse, ignored entirely. In fact, the Royal Society, that bastion of white-bearded wisdom, didn't even allow women to become members at the time. So while Mary was providing material and insights, she was excluded from the very forums where the scientific debates were happening, including the ones where her own work was being discussed. It's not that she wasn't appreciated at all. She had admirers, but they came in the form of footnotes, vague acknowledgements, and sometimes even satire. A famous cartoon showed a fictional Professor Ichthyosaurus lecturing to a room of reptiles, with fossil skeletons hanging around like chandeliers. It was clever. It was Victorian. It was also a quiet jab at how the creatures were being studied without crediting the woman who had uncovered half of them. To add insult to insult, some of her ideas, like how to identify fossilized ink sacs in belemnites, or how to interpret the stomach contents of ichthyosaurs, were dismissed until a male scientist said something similar decades later. Suddenly, he was a visionary. She was still selling fossils to pay the rent. And through all this, Mary continued working. She didn't stop because the credit didn't come. She didn't quit because the spotlight missed her. She kept digging, writing, and answering questions with the patience of someone who knew that science was about discovery, not applause. But it's hard to ignore how her story was paved with polite erasures. She wasn't anonymous because she was shy. She was anonymous because the scientific world had a velvet rope, and Mary Anning, poor female and self-taught, was expected to stay behind it. When she sent her findings, the men translated them into the scientific language of the day, often replacing her clear observations with convoluted Latin, dense theories, and crucially their own names. At the end of her life, Mary was respected locally, and a few scientists even acknowledged her contributions, but she never got the public recognition that her male counterparts received during their careers. No lectures at the Royal Institution, no published papers in her own name, no grand scientific honorifics, just a legacy passed by whisper, letter, and the occasional fossil labeled discovered by someone else. Today, we know better, or at least we try. Statues of Mary Anning have been erected, books written, documentaries made. But the fact remains, during the prime of her career, she was the brains behind countless breakthroughs and yet remained an invisible hand in the annals of paleontology. She wrote the letters, they wrote the papers, and only one of them got a statue while still breathing. By the time Mary Anning reached her 40s, she had helped reconstruct Earth's ancient past and still couldn't afford new shoes. It's one of history's cruelest jokes. She spent her life uncovering monsters from the deep, but her own legacy was buried in the gift shops of the very museums she stocked. The irony, immaculate. Picture this. Victorian families in their finest bonnets and top hats stroll through the British Museum or the Natural History Museum, gaping at the jawbones of ichthyosaurs and the sinuous remains of plesiosaurs, all meticulously labelled, all stunningly displayed, none credited to the sunburned woman back in Lyme Regis who had scraped them from a cliffside during a landslide. Mary's fossils didn't just end up in museums, they filled them. They were centerpieces, conversation starters. Sometimes they even helped launch careers for other people. But Mary's life, by contrast, was a financial tightrope act with no safety net. She had no pension, no salary, and no institution to fall back on, unless you count the seawall she sometimes had to dodge falling rocks from. Despite her global contribution to science, Mary was running a one-woman fossil shop out of her family's modest cottage, trying to keep a roof over her and her dog Trey, who, by the way, was her fossil-hunting companion, and possibly the only creature in England who fully appreciated her talents. Unfortunately, Trey died in a cliff collapse during one of their expeditions, just to add a tragic punctuation mark to the story of Mary's middle years. Though Mary's work had brought prestige and attention to the scientific elite, she remained largely on the fringes, celebrated in private but rarely in public. Letters would arrive from Oxford or London praising her latest discovery, and then disappear into academic desk drawers, never to be mentioned again. She was invited into the occasional scientific conversation, but only as a source, not as a participant. The knowledge, hers, the credit, missing. Even the fossil market itself became a problem. As geology caught on as a gentleman's hobby, competition in Lyme Regis heated up. More collectors meant more prices driven down, and unlike Mary, most of these newcomers weren't using fossil money to buy bread. Some were simply padding their parlour collections. Mary, meanwhile, was trying to pay for lamp oil and laudanum. By the 1840s, her financial situation had become dire. Fossils alone couldn't support her, and even the spectacular finds no longer fetched the prices they once had. It was the scientific equivalent of selling gold and getting paid in gravel. In one particularly bleak stretch, Mary wrote letters asking for help, not with excavation or classification, but with basic survival. Eventually, a few allies stepped in. A sympathetic geologist named Henry Delabèche, one of the few men who actually acknowledged her genius, organized a fundraising campaign through the Geological Society. And here's the part that feels like a rejected Dickens subplot. The society she couldn't join because she was a woman. That same society agreed to grant her a small annual stipend, essentially a charity pension for being a fossil savant. Let's pause for emphasis. The woman who discovered entire prehistoric ecosystems was now relying on donations to stay alive. To make matters worse, her health began to fail. Mary was diagnosed with breast cancer in her late 40s, and medical care in Victorian England was, well, let's say experimental and frequently flammable. Her illness made fossil hunting even harder, and her financial woes didn't disappear. They just limped along beside her like a cruelly tethered shadow. She died in 1847 at the age of 47, quietly. No headlines, no scientific memorials, just the end of a life spent redefining the natural world without being allowed to sign her name at the bottom of the page. And yet, within weeks of her death, those same scientific societies, the ones that never let her in, suddenly found their sense of decency. Obituaries appeared, tributes were written, a stained glass window was even installed in her honor at a church in Lyme Regis, depicting her holding a fossil in one hand and looking very much like someone who should have been appreciated while she was breathing. The great institutions of natural history, they kept her fossils, kept the fame, kept the exhibits, but the woman behind the bones was reduced to a whisper, a rumor in the gift shop, a footnote at best. Mary Anning had changed science. She had cracked open a door to the prehistoric past, and yet, if she had tried to walk through the museum doors without a ticket, she might have been escorted out by a man standing next to her own discovery. In short, she filled Britain's museums but couldn't afford to visit them. Now that is a legacy buried beneath the surface. If there's one thing history loves more than heroes, it's forgetting them for a solid century and then awkwardly circling back with a sheepish "our bad." In the case of Mary Anning, science has been doing just that, slowly and reluctantly giving her the respect she earned during a lifetime of dodging rock slides, institutional snubs and financial despair. Let's rewind just a bit. Mary died in 1847 with no fanfare. Museums displayed her fossils with pride, just not her name. Scientific papers were stuffed with her discoveries, just not her authorship. If she'd been any more invisible, she could have applied for a job as a ghost. But as the 20th century crept on and paleontology matured, something strange began to happen. A few brave souls started asking a forbidden question. Wait, who actually found all these things? Cue a slow burn of long overdue recognition. Biographies began appearing, initially niche, like underground fan mail from history nerds who knew Mary deserved better. Scientists started citing her more openly. Popular science books began including her story, sometimes in full, sometimes as a tragic aside sandwiched between trilobite timelines and T-Rex trivia, but it was progress. By the early 2000s, Mary Anning's name was becoming more than just a whisper in the dusty backrooms of geology departments. In 2010, the Royal Society included her in its list of the 10 British women who have most influenced the history of science. Yes, you read that correctly. The Royal Society, the one that wouldn't let her in back in the day because she was a woman, and also frankly not posh enough to sip tea in the right circles, was finally offering a bit of applause from the high table. And it wasn't just historians and academics who noticed. In 2020, a young British girl named Evie Swire spearheaded a campaign to get a statue of Mary Anning erected in Lyme Regis. Why? Because she was learning about dinosaurs and fossils, and couldn't believe there wasn't already a statue for the woman who discovered half the prehistoric coastline. Evie's logic was airtight. If a town is famous for fossils, and the woman who made it famous doesn't have a statue, something is clearly broken. The campaign caught fire. It sparked interest from scientists, celebrities and local councils, and in 2022, the statue finally became reality. There she was, Mary Anning in bronze, staring out to sea, fossil bags slung over her shoulder, wind in her skirts, and dignity restored, at least in sculptural form. Even Hollywood got the memo. In 2020, the film Ammonite, a fictionalized drama starring Kate Winslet as Mary, hit screens. Now, it took some creative liberties, including an invented romance and a lot of moody staring at cliffs, but it put Mary in the spotlight. For better or weirder, people Googled her. They learned. They asked why they hadn't heard of her before, and that, frankly, is the best kind of awkward question a society can ask itself. Universities now teach her contributions more directly. Children's books depict her as the pioneering girl on the beach with a hammer in one hand and a fossil in the other. Her name has been attached to species, collections, and lectures. And one glorious twist of fate, the Natural History Museum, the one she could never have afforded to enter, now boasts plaques with her name on them, and she's featured in the official educational materials. Mary Anning, fossil hunter, paleontology pioneer, and posthumous icon. The best part? She's finally being seen as a scientist, not just a quirky footnote or a helpful local woman. No longer pigeonholed as a fossil shopkeeper who just happened to trip over some extinct creatures, Mary is recognized for what she truly was, an expert, a trailblazer, and someone who was doing paleontology before the word paleontology had even finished evolving. It took the scientific community 150 years, a public statue campaign, a film adaptation, and the unwavering confusion of a schoolgirl. But they finally got there. They finally said what Mary deserved to hear while she was still alive. You were right, and we should have listened. So next time you stroll through a fossil hall and see some beast with teeth longer than your hand, remember, Mary Anning might have found it first.